Kang Do Jin opened his eyes and saw the sky. Gray, low, alien. He was lying on his back in black sludge, and his silk hanbok was soaking up the swamp water like a sponge. Nearby, on a mound, lay a scroll bearing the imperial seal. The red wax hadn't had time to cool yet. The carriage had already left. The guard didn't even look back. Kang Do Jin sat up and looked around. The swamp stretched in every direction to the very horizon. No trees, no houses, no roads. 12,000 square li of putrid water and black silt. His land, his sentence, his grave. So had the court decided. So Prince Li Hyun had decided. So had his own older brother Kang Tae-woo decided. They were all certain that within a month, the swamp would finish what the court had left undone. But there was one thing they didn't know. The man who was now sitting waist-deep in the mud, staring at the sealed scroll, was not Kang Do Jin. Not exactly. 30 seconds ago, Daniel Kang from Portland, Oregon, was driving his pickup truck down a highway at night. In the bed lay bags of mushroom mycelium and containers of soil samples. His eyes were closing. The steering wheel jerked. A ditch. Darkness. And now here he was, in a stranger's body, in a stranger's world, in a swamp that stinks like an industrial sludge pit after an accident. Daniel raised his hands to his face. Someone else's hands. The slender fingers of an aristocrat, not a single callus. He clenched his fists and unclenched them. Clenched and unclenched. The body obeyed. His heart was beating. His lungs were breathing. He was alive. Or alive again. Or alive for the first time. He didn't yet know which option was correct. Memory came in a wave. Not his memory. Someone else's. The face of a woman with weary eyes. His mother. A concubine. The voice of his older brother, who had promised to protect him. The taste of the rice wine that Prince Li Hyun had been pouring into his cup all evening before insulting his mother in front of the entire court. The slap. The silence of the hall. The verdict. Daniel shook his head. The foreign memories receded but did not disappear. They settled somewhere at the bottom of his consciousness like sediment in a test tube. He knew they would return. Later. In his dreams. At the most inopportune moment. But right now, he had no time for someone else's tears. Right now, he needed to figure out where he was and what to do about it. He stood up. His feet sank ankle-deep into the mud. The hanbok weighed like a lead apron. Daniel pulled off the top layer and tossed it onto a mound. He was left in his undershirt. Then he bent down and scooped up a handful of dirt. It was an automatic movement. 3 years of field work. Hundreds of samples. Daniel Kang's body remembered this gesture better than his own name. He rubbed the mud between his fingers. He sniffed it and froze. Something had happened. Something that never happens. The mud in his hands suddenly became transparent. Not visually, not to the eye. He just knew. Sulfide compounds. Iron-oxidizing bacteria. An anaerobic zone. Organic matter in a concentration he'd seen only once in his life at an experimental site in Louisiana, where they were restoring the soil after an oil spill. There was no curse here. Here was a regenerative environment with such a high nutrient content that any agronomist would sell his soul for a single hectare. 12,000 square meters of it. Daniel dropped the mud back into the water. He looked at his hands. He looked at the swamp. And he laughed. Quietly at first, then louder. Then he fell to his knees right into the water and roared with laughter so loudly that he startled the herons from the distant backwater. They had given him the best land on the continent. They had wrapped the gold vein in the wrapping of a death sentence and tossed it at his feet. "Thank you, Your Highness, really, thank you." The laughter subsided. Daniel wiped his face with a muddy hand, smearing silt across his cheek. He stood up. He looked around again, but now with different eyes. Not the eyes of an exile, but those of an engineer. Over there to the west, the terrain rises slightly. That means we can build the first dwelling there. Over there to the south, the water is darker, deeper, perhaps an old riverbed. If we clear it out and channel the flow, the drainage problem in the eastern section will resolve itself. And over there to the north, some stone debris is sticking out of the water, a foundation. Old, very old. Something used to stand here. He headed west. Every step was a struggle. The silt sucked at his feet. He lost his Kanboko boots after 200 steps and continued barefoot. By sunset, he found what he was looking for, an old guardhouse on a stone foundation. The walls were made of weathered wood. Half the roof had caved in. Inside it was damp and smelled of mold, but the stone was dry. The floor was raised above the water level. The door was still on its hinges. Daniel went inside and sat down on the stone floor. He took a scroll bearing the imperial seal from his bosom. He unrolled it. He read it. Someone else's memory helped him decipher the characters. A charter of grant, for exceptional service to the throne, for the audacity shown in the presence of the heir. 12,000 square li of the Puyang Marsh, granted for perpetual and undivided possession. Land without rank, without spiritual energy, without the right to have its status reviewed, without the right to reclaim the title, without the right to appeal to the Council of Houses. Forever. He rolled up the scroll and set it aside. Perpetual ownership of land that cannot be sold, cannot be transferred, cannot be ennobled, cannot even be officially marked on a map. Elegant. He had to appreciate the grace of the execution. Daniel lay down on the rock and closed his eyes. His body ached. His head buzzed with other people's memories. His stomach was empty. Frogs were croaking behind the wall, and somewhere in the distance a night bird was calling. He thought of his lab in Portland, of the coffee machine that was always leaking, about his colleague Mark, who always forgot to label the samples, about his mom, who called every Sunday and asked when he was going to get married. All of that was in another world, in another life, in another body. Now he was Kang Do Jin, 22 years old, the son of a concubine, an outcast, the owner of a swamp, and a soil scientist. That the one thing no one in this world knew, and that one thing was the only thing that mattered. He fell asleep. He slept without dreams. The first day was over. Morning came with fog, a thick white fog that turned the swamp into a milky lake. Daniel woke up from the cold and hunger. His body ached. This foreign body felt uncharacteristically weak, an aristocrat who had never done manual labor. His muscles were thin. His stamina was non-existent. He would have to do something about this. He stepped out of the guardhouse and looked out at the swamp through the fog. Somewhere to the east, beyond the haze, there must be a village. He'd seen smoke yesterday at sunset, 3 or 4 plumes of smoke. A small village on the border of the Deadlands. People who live next to the cursed land and know more about it than any imperial cartographer. He needed people. But first, he needed proof. Daniel went down to the water. He crouched down and plunged both hands into the mud. That sensation again. Transparency. Information poured in like a torrent. He could feel every layer of soil a meter down. Clay, peat, sand. The remains of root systems hundreds of years old. Spores that had waited so long to awaken that they had nearly turned to stone. And deeper, even deeper. Stone, cut stone, foundations, pavement, an entire city beneath the silt. He pulled his hands back. His heart was pounding. It was too much information, too deep. He remembered the main thing. The soil was alive. Beneath a layer of stagnant water and rotten peat lay a fertile layer that had been accumulating organic matter for 1,000 years. Like a compost pit the size of a province. All he had to do was remove the top layer and let the earth breathe. But first, he needed rice. Ordinary rice, a handful of grains, and people who would see what he could do with them. He set off eastward through the fog. He walked for 2 hours, barefoot over bumps and through shallow water. Twice he sank waist deep. Once he nearly stepped on a snake. By noon the fog had cleared, and he saw a village. 10 houses, maybe 12. Low mud brick walls, thatched roofs, skinny chickens in the yards, vegetable gardens with stunted greens, the smell of smoke and boiled millet. Poverty, but not hunger, not yet hunger. They spotted him from afar. A dirty man in a tattered undershirt, walking barefoot from the direction of the Deadlands. Not the most common sight. The children hid behind fences. The women went inside their houses. An old man with a walking stick stepped out onto the road. The village headman. Daniel realized this when the other men lined up behind him. 5 of them. Thin, tanned, and wary. The village headman asked who he was and where he had come from. Daniel replied that he was the new owner of the Puyang Marsh. Silence. Then one of the men snorted. Then another laughed. A minute later, all 5 were laughing. Even the village head smiled. They'd heard that an aristocrat from the capital had received the Deadlands as a gift. The whole district had been talking about it all week. Poor fool. A gentleman who'd come to his doom. They hadn't expected him to survive past the first rain. And there he stood before them, barefoot and dirty, asking for a handful of rice. The village head looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. He ordered them to bring it. A woman brought out a clay bowl of grain. Ordinary rice. Small, dull grains with black specks. The worst kind. Daniel took the bowl and thanked her. Then he turned toward the swamp. He said he wanted to show them something. He asked them to come with him. The village head looked at his people. He shrugged. They went, all 7 of them, and 3 boys who tagged along behind them. Daniel led them to a backwater a quarter-hour's walk from the village, the filthiest place he'd ever seen. Black water, methane bubbles on the surface. Not even frogs lived here. He took off his shoes, though there was really no need to. He waded into the water up to his waist. The villagers stood on the bank, exchanging glances. He scooped a handful of rice from a bowl. He clenched it in his fist. He closed his eyes. And that's when something happened that Daniel himself hadn't expected. He felt the grains. Not with his fingers. Deeper. He could see every grain from the inside. A dormant embryo. A starchy husk. A genetic code as simple as a child's counting rhyme. And nearby, in the water around his feet, he sensed something else. Ancient seeds in the silt. Grasses that hadn't existed for 1,000 years. Algae with such a high concentration of minerals that they glowed in his inner vision like neon threads. He reached out toward them, not with his hand, but with something else. He took the marsh grass's resistance to salt water. He took the ancient algae's growth rate. He imbued the rice with these qualities, just as an engineer loads new parameters into a program. He opened his fist, tossed the grains into the water, and sat down on the bank. The peasants stood and watched. Nothing happened. The village headman opened his mouth, but he didn't manage to say a word. The water in the backwater stirred. Green strands stretched from the black depths toward the surface, as thin as a hair, then thicker, then even thicker. A minute later, a green tuft of sprouts stood above the water. The peasants took a step back. One of the men sat down on the ground. The boys froze, their mouths agape. The village headman stood and watched. He just stood there and watched. Daniel sat on the bank and felt his strength draining away. His head was spinning. His hands were trembling, but he was smiling. He knew that by evening the sprouts would become stalks. In 3 days there would be ears of rice. In a week, it would be time to harvest. Rice on the dead land. Rice in a place where even the gods had placed a seal of damnation. He turned to the village elder. He said the rice would have a bitter aftertaste. Salt. It would wash out in 2 seasons. For now, let them salt it. In winter, they'll be grateful. The village elder sank to his knees. Daniel stood up. His legs wouldn't obey him, but he stood up. He walked over to the old man. He lifted him by the shoulders, and he said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't bow to me. Bow to the earth. I simply listened to her." He didn't know that a year later, this phrase would become the motto of an entire city. Right now, he just wanted to sleep. They carried him to the guardhouse. They laid him on a mat brought by the wife of one of the peasants. They covered him with a blanket. They left a bowl of millet and the jug of water. Daniel fell asleep instantly. His body shut down like an overheated machine. The gift had taken everything, every last drop of energy. He slept until the next morning, and when he woke up, 12 people were sitting next to the guardhouse. The village headman, 5 of his men, 2 women, 3 teenagers, and an old man he hadn't seen before, a legless veteran with the eyes of a man who had long since given up hope. 12 people who had come to the dead land of their own free will. The first 12 inhabitants of Puyon. The village head stood up when Do Jin stepped out of the guardhouse. He said that last night they had harvested the first rice from the paddy field. 3 sacks. The grains were large and heavy, with a greenish tint. They were bitter, but if rinsed twice, they could be cooked into porridge. He placed a sack at Do Jin's feet and bowed, not to the earth, but to him. Do Jin didn't argue. The irrigation ditch was growing slowly. The earth refused to release the water. The silt was sticky as tar, and every swing of the shovel required double the effort. Daniel kept count. 12 men, 6 shovels, 2 axes, 1 knife. Not a single wheelbarrow, not a single bucket. In the first 3 days, they dug a ditch 200 paces long and waist deep. On the 4th day, the water started flowing. A thin, murky stream flowed south toward the lowlands, and the eastern section began to dry up. Do Jin stood at the edge of the ditch and watched the water recede. The clay was slowly being exposed. Gray, heavy, dense. Good clay. He crouched down and touched it with his palm. The information came instantly. Mineral composition, density, permeability. You could lay a foundation on this clay. You could mold bricks if you fired it. You could make roof tiles. He stood up and looked west. There, beyond the strip of shallow water, he sensed a sandy ridge. Sand and clay, the 2 main building materials, and both right under his feet. He smiled to himself. In Portland, developers would be fighting like dogs over a plot like this. Work didn't stop for a single day. Do Jin assigned the men their tasks. 6 were digging a second ditch to the north. 3 were gathering stones from the swamp. The The fragments of old foundations he'd sensed underwater turned out to be excellent building material. Granite, hewn. It had lain in the silt for 1,000 years without a single crack. Stones from ancient Puyan, a city that no longer existed. The women set about preparing food. The rice from the paddy had to be rinsed 3 times to remove the bitterness, but it was filling. Every morning before work, Do Jin would go to the paddy and check on the crops. The sprouts were growing stronger. The foliage was thick and lush. He touched the stems and assessed their condition. The roots were healthy. There were enough minerals. In 5 days, they would be able to harvest the second crop. But rice wasn't everything. The people needed protection from the wind. They needed wood. They needed walls. On the 7th day, he did what would later be called the first miracle of Puyan. He rose before dawn. He walked to the western shore, where a sandy ridge rose above the water. He sat down on the sand. He plunged his hands into the earth and reached deep down. There, in the silt, he found them. Seeds. Ancient willow seeds sealed in clay hundreds of years ago. Dead to any botanist in the world, but not to him. He sensed life within them. Tiny, smoldering, like embers that hadn't gone out for 1,000 years. He pulled them up, gave them water, gave them air, rewrote their inner script. The willow that normally takes 50 years to grow was commanded to grow in a single night. He poured everything he had into it, every drop of strength, every gram of concentration. His hands were on fire. His temples were throbbing. Sweat streamed into his eyes. He kept his hands on the ground until he could no longer feel his own fingers. Then he threw up. Then he fell face first into the sand. The villagers found him in the morning. He lay unconscious on the shore, and behind him stood a grove of willows. 32 trees, trunks thick enough to wrap your arms around, branches reaching all the way to the ground, roots stretching deep into the sand and clay. Trees that looked to be 50 years old. Yesterday, this had been an empty shore. The village elder stood and watched. Then he sat down right in the mud and covered his face with his hands. Do Jin slept through the entire day and night. When he woke up, a woman he had never seen before was sitting next to him, a young woman, with a child in her arms. She had come from a village across the river, a 2-day journey. She had heard about the rice in the marsh. She didn't believe it. She went to take a look. She saw the willows. She stayed. 3 more people came after her. Her husband, his brother, her mother-in-law. 12 became 16. By the end of the 2nd week, there were 23 of them. People arrived one by one or in pairs, all different. A runaway farmhand from the north whose master had taken his daughter as payment for debts. A widow with 3 children who'd been driven out of her village because she brought misfortune. 2 fishermen brothers accused of stealing nets from the local feudal lord. A cripple, an orphan, a thief. All those from whom the world had turned its back. They came to the Deadlands because they had nowhere else to fall. Jin took everyone in. He gave each of them work. He explained to each of them what to do. He didn't ask where they came from or what they'd done. He was interested in only one thing. Could you handle a shovel? If not, he taught them. The willow grove became Puyan's first wall. The branches intertwined so thickly that the wind couldn't pass through them. Awnings could be strung up between the trees. It was dry under the awnings. Jin planned the camp like an engineer. A sleeping area, a cooking area, a storage area, an outhouse to the south, downstream from the ditch. When he explained why the outhouse needed to be built separately and downstream, the peasants looked at him as if he were crazy. He didn't bother explaining about bacteria and sanitation. He simply said that the earth doesn't like dirt near food. They accepted that. By the 3rd week, he began building the first house, not for himself, but for a widow with 3 children. The children coughed at night. They needed a roof over their heads. Walls made of willow poles plastered with clay. A roof of reeds that he had grown in 2 days on the southern backwater. The floor was made of mud bricks, raised above the ground on a stone foundation. Old granite boulders from the swamp fit into the foundation as if laid out with a ruler. Then Jin remembered how Mark had joked in the lab that soil scientists were just builders digging in the wrong direction. Now he was digging in the right direction. The house turned out small, 2 rooms, a low ceiling, but it was dry, warm, with a door that closed. The widow went inside and didn't come out for an hour. When she did come out, her eyes were red, but she was smiling. The children ran in after her and started rolling around on the floor, squealing with delight. Do Jin stood outside and watched, and he thought that in a past life he had designed soil restoration systems for corporations that paid him $120,000 a year, and not a single one of those corporations had given him what he was feeling right now. He built the 2nd house for a legless veteran, the 3rd for a family of fishermen. By the end of the 1st month in Puyan, there were 8 houses standing. The willow grove had grown. Do Jin had planted hazelnut and wild plum trees next to the willows. In a month there would be hazelnuts, in 2 months the first plums. He touched each tree before planting it. He set parameters for each one: endurance, growth rate, yield. Each one drained his strength, and each time he took a little longer to recover. His body was getting used to it, but the gift didn't get any easier. He was simply learning to allocate his resources better, not to use it all at once, not to dig deeper than necessary, and not to try to rewrite too much with a single touch. Toward the end of the 4th week, So-Rin arrived. He remembered that day because it was the first time he'd seen the blueprint and realized there was someone here smarter than him. She appeared at dawn, alone, carrying nothing except a leather tube with blueprints and a charcoal pencil tucked behind her ear. Thin, dirty, with scraped-up feet in worn-out men's boots. Her face was sharp, determined, and fierce. She walked through the entire camp without looking around. She approached Do Jin, who was sitting by the ditch, sketching a plan for a drainage system with a stick on the clay. She stood over him and said she'd heard they were building a city here. She said she was an architect. She said she needed a job. Do Jin looked up and glanced at her, then at the pipe, then back at her. He asked to see the blueprints. She unfolded the first sheet. City Hall, stone, 2 stories, with a central colonnade and an open courtyard. The lines were flawless. The proportions were dynamic. Do Jin stared at it for 20 seconds. He wasn't an architect, but he was an engineer, and he could see the structure. He poked his finger at the left corner. He said the support here wouldn't hold. He pointed to the central arch. He said this part was brilliant. He said they'd start building tomorrow. Rin blinked. Then she blinked again. Then she rolled up the blueprint, turned silently, and walked toward the willow grove. He found her an hour later. She was sitting under a willow tree, staring at her hands. He sat down beside her. He asked where she was from. She explained briefly. The Imperial Academy of Architects. The only woman in her class in 12 years. Top grades. Best thesis project. And then Master Pak said that a woman's blueprint couldn't stand, that the walls would collapse if built by a woman's hand, that nature wouldn't allow it. Her project was taken away and given to the master's son, who received the title for it. So Rin left that night. She stole her blueprints back. The 2nd month began with rain, 3 days straight. The water rose. The ditches overflowed. 2 houses were flooded. Do Jin stood in the downpour and watched as 3 weeks' worth of work went underwater. So Rin stood beside him and said nothing. Then she said they needed stilts. Houses on stilts aren't afraid of water. She was right. Do Jin nodded. They redrew the plans in a single night. All the new houses would be on stilts. The 2 flooded ones would be dismantled and moved. That meant 3 times as much work, 3 times as much wood, 3 times as much stone for the foundations, and 3 times as many hands, which they didn't have. On the 4th day, the rain stopped. The sun came out, and the swamp began to steam. Fog rose from the water like the breath of a huge sleeping beast. Do Jin went out to the rice fields to check on the crops. The rice had held up. The stalks had bent but not broken. The roots, which he had reinforced, held the plants in the silt like anchors. He picked up a single stem and scanned it. Healthy, enough minerals, 2 weeks until harvest. He straightened up and saw people on the road. 6, no, 7. They were coming from the direction of the Eastern Highway. Leading the way was a woman in a dark travel cloak. Behind her was a man with a cart. On the cart were bundles, sacks, and something wrapped in oiled cloth. The other 5 were porters. The woman walked quickly and confidently. She didn't look back. Jin went down to the road and waited. The woman stopped 10 paces away from him. She pulled back her hood. She was young, perhaps his age, or maybe a little younger. She had a round face with a pointed chin and lively eyes. 12 small pouches hung in a row from her belt, each a different color. She looked at him, then she looked at the marsh behind him. She looked at the willow grove and the stilt houses that So-Rin had only just begun to build. She said her name was Yoon Mei, the youngest daughter of the Yoon trading house. She'd come to see the eccentric who grows rice on the dead land. Do Jin asked what she saw. Yoon Mei answered without hesitation. She saw a swamp, 3 rice paddies, a grove of trees that look 50 years old but are actually only a month old. 30-something people doing work that would normally require 300, and a complete lack of commercial infrastructure. No warehouse, no dock, no trading floor, not a single contract with outside buyers. Do Jin looked at her and thought that in a past life, she would have been the best business consultant in all of Portland. He asked why she had come. Yoon Mei answered directly. The Yoon family was ruined. Her father had been humiliated by the aristocrats to whom he had lent money. The debts were written off. Their property had been confiscated. Her older brothers had fled. She was left alone with a caravan of goods she'd managed to hide before the confiscation, and she needed a place where she wouldn't be found. Do Jin nodded. He asked what was on the cart. Yunmei listed the items: 200 cubits of fabric, 50 pounds of salt, 30 pounds of iron nails, a set of carpentry tools, 2 sacks of barley, a barrel of oil, and a sack of seeds from the southern provinces that she'd bought from a sailor at the port, not knowing what kind of seeds they were, but knowing that rare seeds are always expensive. When Do Jin heard about the seeds, his eyes lit up. He walked over to the cart. He untied the sack. He reached inside. The seeds were small and rough, smelling of dust and something slightly bitter. He clenched a handful and closed his eyes. The information came in a wave. Camphor tree, cinnamon, indigo. 3 species not found in this province. 3 species that were worth more than silver on the capital's market. He opened his eyes and looked at Yunmei. He said she had just brought him a fortune in that sack. Yunmei raised an eyebrow. He explained. Camphor tree. The oil from its bark cures half of all known diseases. Liniment. Its bark is a spice that aristocrats buy by the weight of gold. Indigofera. It's used to make a blue dye that doesn't fade. 3 crops, 3 sources of income. None of them grow at this latitude, but they'll grow in Puyan, because he'll tell them to. Yunmei stared at him for 10 seconds. Then she said she wanted to be his chief merchant, but on one condition: he would never ask her to marry for convenience. Do Jin replied that it was a deal, definitely not for money. Yunmei stood there for half a minute, trying to figure out what he meant. Then she turned around and went to unload the cart. Behind Do Jin, So-rin gave a quiet chuckle. Do Jin pretended not to hear it. Yunmei's arrival changed everything. Not because she brought goods, though the nails and tools were worth their weight in gold, but because she knew how to do the math. Do Jin was a scholar. So-rin was an architect. Neither of them knew how to sell a sack of rice. Yunmei did. She knew the prices of every commodity in every city within a 500-li radius. She knew which trade routes were open during which seasons. She knew which merchants were honest and which would cheat at the first opportunity. That very first evening, she sat down with Do Jin and So-rin by the campfire and spread her map out on the ground. Not a geographical map, a trade map. Routes, prices, seasons, names. Do Jin looked at the map and saw a system, like an ecosystem made only of people and money instead of roots and water. Yunmei pointed to a spot on the map, the city of Taeguan, a 2-day journey south, a trade hub. There's a merchant's guild there that controls the supply of medicinal herbs to the southern provinces. If Puyang can offer them herbs that aren't available anywhere else on the market, the guild will come to him with a contract. Do Jin nodded. He already knew what he could grow. The next day, he got started. Camphor seeds first. He took 20 seeds. He sat down on a parched patch of land east of the willow grove. He pressed each seed into the ground. He closed his eyes. The camphor tree grows in the tropics. Here, it's colder, drier, and windier. He needed to rewrite the code. He took the frost resistance from a local pine tree. He took the ability to survive in waterlogged soil. He infused these traits into the camphor seeds. He didn't change the essence of the tree. He changed the conditions in which it could live, just as a programmer adapts code to a new operating system. 20 seeds. 20 trees. He didn't rush them to full growth. A lesson from the willow grove. Too fast means too much pain. He set them on a 5-year growth cycle to be completed in 3 months. Slower, gentler, less pain. By evening, he could stand on his own 2 feet. Progress. So Rin noticed that he'd changed his approach. She asked why. He replied that he was learning. That the first time with the willows, he'd been like a student taking his first exam. He gave it his all and collapsed. Now he understands his limits. So Rin nodded. She said it was the same for her. She spent a week without sleep drawing her first sketch. Now she draws them in 3 hours, and they're better. They were silent for a moment. Then So-rin went back to her sketches, while Do Jin stayed seated by the young camphor trees, watching as sprouts break through the earth. He planted the liniment 3 days later, the indigofera 5 days later. Each plant required its own approach, its own adaptations, its own balance between speed and energy expenditure. He kept records, not on paper, there was no paper, with a sharp stick on birch bark, tables, graphs, growth times, energy expenditure. Yunmei saw his birch bark notes and didn't understand what they were at first. Then he explained, "It's a quarterly report." Yunmei asked what a quarterly report was. He replied that it's when you take stock of what you have and what you're missing once every 3 months. Yunmei said she took stock every day. He replied that she was already the CFO. Youngmei didn't understand that either, but it sounded important. The middle of the second month brought the first real guests. Not refugees, not peasants. 2 well-dressed men with crests on their sashes. They introduced themselves as merchants from Taeguan. They said they'd heard about the rice in the marsh and wanted to buy some. Do Jin received them in the willow grove under the canopy that So-rin had built as a temporary meeting hall. A long table made of planks nailed together, stone benches. The merchants sat down and looked around. Their faces were calm, but their eyes darted about. Do Jin noticed. He'd learned to read people in the lab. Colleagues who want to steal an idea always smile too broadly. These two were smiling exactly like that. They offered to buy all of the Puyon rice at half the market price. Do Jin looked at Yun-mei, who was standing behind him. Yun-mei nodded almost imperceptibly. Don't sell. He turned to the merchants and said the rice wasn't for sale. The merchants exchanged glances. One of them smiled even wider. He said that the Lord of the Deadland was in a difficult situation, that help should be accepted while it's offered, that the world beyond the swamp isn't so kind. Do Jin listened and remained silent. Then he stood up. He walked over to the nearest camphor tree. He touched the trunk. He turned to the merchants. He said he could see. He could see that they weren't merchants. A merchant doesn't carry a sword under his cloak. A merchant doesn't leave 4 men hiding in the bushes behind the grove. And a merchant knows that camphor oil is worth more than all the rice they'd offered to buy. They aren't merchants. They're scouts. The only question is, whose? Silence. One of the men put his hand on his belt. The second one didn't move. A rustling sound came from behind the grove. Do Jin stood calmly. He didn't know how to fight. An aristocrat's body knew not a single fighting technique. But he stood calmly because he saw something they didn't. 3 willow trees behind their backs. He had planted those willows. He knew every one of their roots, and he knew that the willow's roots went 3 meters deep and spread 10 meters in every direction. He placed his hand on the trunk of the nearest tree and sent a pulse. The ground beneath the men's feet trembled, slightly, barely noticeable. The roots stirred in the clay. Yun-mei returned 6 days later, with a contract, and a bruise under her left eye. The contract was for the supply of camphor oil to the Taegwan Trading Guild, 200 pounds per season at a price Yun-mei called fair and Do Jin called unbelievable. She'd gotten the bruise from a rival merchant who'd tried to ambush her as she was leaving the guild. She'd struck him first, with a drawing tube she'd borrowed from So-rin. Do Jin listened to her story and thought that in this world, women who hit men with drawing tubes were probably not the norm, but in Puyon, it would be the norm. The contract with the guild had changed Puyon's status, unofficially. Officially, Puyon remained a deadland, without rank or rights. But in practice, the Taegwan Guild now had a financial stake in its survival, and merchants protect their interests better than soldiers. Yun-mei explained this while sitting at a long table under a canopy, laying out the coins she'd received as an advance. 200 silver coins, a small fortune. With this money, he could hire carpenters, buy tools, order iron for nails and staples, maybe even buy 2 oxen for heavy labor. Do Jin looked at the coins and thought about priorities. In Portland, he'd drawn up business plans for a startup and knew that the first funds go not toward aesthetics, but toward infrastructure. First, the oxen. Without their pulling power, they wouldn't be able to clear the riverbed. Then the tools. Then hired carpenters. Then iron. Yun-mei nodded and took notes. On birch bark, with a stick. Do Jin promised himself that someday in Puyon there would be paper and ink. The first 2 months had passed, and the third was beginning. The population had grown to 45 people. People continued to arrive. Most were from the east, from villages situated on low-rank lands, 7th, 8th, and nearly 9th. Lands where the harvest had failed for the 3rd year in a row. Do Jin had noticed this. People said that the land was growing weary, that the spiritual currents were weakening, that the temple of the 9th rank promised to perform a renewal ritual, but the ritual cost more than the village's entire annual harvest. He listened and thought. The land does not grow weary. The land is being depleted. Monoculture, lack of crop rotation, no soil management. These people had been planting rice in the same field for 1,000 years and were surprised that it was dying. It was so familiar it made his teeth ache. He'd seen the same thing in Iowa, in California, in Louisiana, on another planet, another civilization, and the exact same mistake. The Earth isn't infinite, but that's a problem for later. Right now, the riverbed awaited him. So Rin found it first, an old map on the back of a page, drawn from memory by a legless veteran. The veteran was from a village 2 days' journey to the west. When he was a child, the elders told him that a river once flowed through the Puyon swamp. A wide river, navigable. Until the emperor cursed the land and the river sank beneath the silt. So Rin superimposed the veteran's drawing onto her map of the area. The lines matched what Do Jin sensed beneath the ground. A dark strip to the south, deep water. Not stagnant swamp water, but living, flowing water. The river didn't disappear. It had gone underground. It flowed beneath a layer of silt and clay and emerged somewhere in the southwest, into the sea or into another river. If the old riverbed were cleared, if 1,000 years' worth of sediment were removed, if the water were released to the surface, then Puyan would have a river. And a river means a trade route. It means fish. It means fresh water for irrigation. That's everything. Do Jin stood over the map and calculated. The riverbed was about 4,000 paces long within the boundaries of Puyan. He estimated the width to be 30 paces. The depth beneath the silt was 3 to 4 times a person's height. To clear it with shovels would require 500 people and half a year. He had 45 men and 2 oxen that Yunmei hadn't bought yet. Impossible, if done by hand. He walked out to the southern section. He stood over the spot where he sensed the water most strongly. He dropped to his knees. He placed his palms on the ground, and he reached down, deeper than ever before, past the layer of silt, past the clay, to the riverbed itself. There, beneath the thick layer of sediment, lay a rocky bottom, and water flowed along that bottom, slow, cold, alive. And along the banks of the old riverbed lay roots, giant, dead roots of trees that had grown here 1,000 years ago. The root system of the ancient Puyan forest. An entire network 3 arm spans thick and hundreds of steps long. Wood petrified by time and pressure, stronger than iron, but not dead. In the very heart of the deepest root, he felt a spark, smoldering, like embers in willow seeds, only older, much older. He could awaken them. He could make the roots grow upward through the silt, breaking through the sediment. The roots would break through the surface, and the silt would settle to the sides. The riverbed would open up on its own, like an abscess that bursts when heated, but it would cost him dearly. The willow grove had cost him a day's sleep. Here the scale was 10 times greater. He didn't know if he could handle it. He went to So Rin. He told her he could open up the river. He explained how. So Rin listened in silence. Then she asked what would happen to him afterward. He answered honestly. He didn't know. Maybe he'd sleep for 3 days. Maybe a week. Maybe he wouldn't wake up at all. So Rin was silent for a long time. Then she said she wouldn't let him. She said the river could wait, that they would live to see the river, but without him, they wouldn't. Do Jin looked at her. She stood upright. Her hands were clenched, a pencil tucked behind her ear. Her face was stony, but her voice wavered on the last word. He nodded. He said she was right. The river would wait. Instead of the river, he started small. Every day he went to the southern section and worked on the roots. He didn't wake them up completely. He just moved them, stretched them out. Like a physical therapist works on atrophied muscles, little by little, a meter a day, the roots began to remember what it meant to grow. He spent 2 hours on this every morning, and by noon he could barely stand on his feet. But he didn't fall. He didn't lose consciousness. Every noon, Rin would bring him rice and silently set it down beside him. He would eat, rest for an hour. Then he'd go to work with the others. Shovels, ditches, stones, walls. The same thing every day, work. For the entire 3rd month, he led a double life. A builder by day. In the mornings and evenings, the one who speaks with the earth. The settlement was changing. So Rin had finished the project for the first houses on stilts. Long structures on stone pillars, with a shared roof and separate rooms. Below the houses was a storage area for tools and supplies. Above were the living quarters. Clever, simple, beautiful. Until then, Jin had looked at the finished house and thought that So Rin did for wood and stone what he did for the earth and seeds. She listens to the materials. Yunmei returned from her second trip to Taeguan with 2 oxen and 3 hired carpenters. The carpenters were old, experienced, and heavy drinkers. One of them looked at the houses on stilts and said he'd only seen such structures in the coastal towns of the south. He asked who had designed them. Do Jin pointed to So Rin. The carpenter looked at her. He looked at the house. He shrugged and said he didn't care who drew up the plans. It stood solidly. So Rin didn't smile, but the pencil behind her ear twitched. Toward the end of the 3rd month, a guest arrived whom no one was expecting. Or rather, whom they were expecting, but not so soon. Han Sol. She came at night, literally, until Jin woke up to find someone sitting on the floor of his room, smoking a pipe. Thin, sweetish smoke with a hint of bitterness. Herbal. He opened his eyes and saw a silhouette. A woman in dark clothes, gloves on her hands, long hair tied back in a careless knot, a pipe between her teeth. She was looking at the birch bark notes he'd left on the table. He sat up.
She didn't turn around. She said she found his notes interesting. She said the notation he used for mineral compounds descended the system of her late master, only more precise. Do Jin asked who she was. Han Sol, an alchemist, a student of Master Kyung-sik, the very same one whom the Temple of the Nine Ranks burned 3 years ago for heresy.
Master Kyung-sik claimed that the ranks of the earth were not a divine order, but the result of the soil's chemical composition, which could be altered. The temple disagreed. The pyre proved more persuasive than his arguments. Han Sol removed the glove from her right hand. In the dim light of the oil lamp, Do Jin saw them. Burns. Old ones. From her wrist to her fingertips. She said she'd tried to continue his work. There were results. 2 explosions, 1 fire, 3 burns. The temple issued a warrant for her arrest. She fled south, then west. Then she heard about Puyong, about the land without rank where rice grows, about a madman who can hear the earth, and she came. Do Jin remained silent. He looked at her hands. Then he asked what she knew about the process of separating mineral salts. Han Sol answered. He asked another question. She answered. He asked a third. She not only answered but also corrected him. He asked a fourth. They talked until dawn. Do Jin explained things to her that no one in this world knew. Organic chemistry, acid-base balance, the nitrogen cycle, the role of fungi in the ecosystem. He spoke and Han Sol listened, at first in silence, then with her mouth agape. Then she began to take notes, on his birch bark, with his stick, quickly, eagerly, like a person who had wandered in the dark for 3 years and suddenly saw the light. When he explained to her that the mold she had considered a pest actually breaks down dead organic matter into nutrients for plants, she fell silent. Then she took off her second glove. Then she covered her face with her hands. She was crying, quietly, soundlessly. Her shoulders were trembling. Do Jin didn't move. He waited. A minute later she lifted her face. Red eyes, wet cheeks. The 4th month. Puyong was no longer a camp. Puyong had become a settlement. 12 houses on stilts, 2 communal storage sheds. Han Sol's laboratory, the carpenter's workshop, a kitchen under a canopy where 3 women cooked for everyone. The willow grove was growing denser. The camphor trees stretched upward. The linneman had sprouted its first branches. The indigo bush bloomed blue. Do Jin looked at all this from the roof of the town hall, which So Rin was still designing only on bark. 53 people, 6 rice fields, 3 medicinal plantations, a drainage system of 12 ditches. The river still slumbered underground, but the roots were already stirring. Every morning he felt their movement, slow, powerful, like the muscles of a giant tossing and turning in his sleep. 2 more months, maybe 3. The roots would break through the surface on their own, without his help, without his pain. He had taught them to grow. From there, they would manage on their own. That was the main principle, not to control, but to guide. Set the process in motion and step back. An ecosystem doesn't need a commander, it needs an initial impulse. Yunmei brought back not only money, but also people from her latest trip. 15 families from ravaged villages in the east. The peasants had heard of Puyong, of the land that yields a bountiful harvest, of the lord who waives taxes for the first year, and of the stilt houses that stay dry. They came with their children, their livestock, and bundles on their backs. Do Jin welcomed each one. He brought them before So Rin, who determined where each would live, before Yunmei, who recorded their skills, before Han Sol, who examined the sick. And there were many sick people. Coughs, fevers, festering wounds, children with bloated bellies from worms. Han Sol cursed. She smoked her pipe so fiercely that the smoke rose in a column. She didn't have enough of her potions. She needed herbs that weren't available here. Do Jin listened to the list. He went to the southern section. He returned 3 hours later with a basket of fresh herbs. Mint, wormwood, thyme, yarrow, chamomile. He had grown them right there, drawing on the properties already present in the soil for each plant. Han Sol took the basket. She sniffed each bunch. She tasted them on her tongue. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she silently went to the lab and didn't come out for 2 days. When she emerged, she had a full set of medicines. For coughs, for fevers, for parasites, for inflammation. Everything was labeled. Everything came with documentation. She placed the box in front of Do Jin and said these were the best potions she'd ever made. That the herbs he'd grown were purer and more potent than any wild ones. That if he could grow such herbs consistently, she'd be able to treat not 50 people, but 5,000. Do Jin nodded. He said he could do it. He asked her to make a list of all the herbs she would need for the year. Han Sol smiled. The list took up 4 birch bark sheets, front and back. The population was growing faster than Do Jin could build. This created problems he hadn't anticipated. Not hunger. The rice was growing steadily. Not the cold. Soren's houses were warm. The problem was the people. 50 people is a village where everyone knows each other. 70 is already a crowd. Arguments began over a spot by the well, over the line to the workshop, over who was whose neighbor. A runaway farmhand didn't want to live next to a former thief. A fisherman thought he deserved a better house because he'd arrived earlier. A widow complained that her neighbor's children were noisy at night. Do Jin sat on the threshold of his guardhouse and listened to the complaints, one after another, patiently, intently. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a judge, he was a soil scientist. But in Portland, he'd worked at a startup for 3 years and knew that a team of 15 people already required rules, while 70 required a system. He gathered everyone around a large campfire that evening. He stood before them. He said that Puyon needed laws, not imperial ones, its own, simple ones. 3 rules. First, those who work eat. There are no sick and healthy, no old and young, no former thieves and former masters. There are those who work and those who cannot. Those who cannot work receive help. Those who can but do not want to leave. Second, disputes are resolved by the council, not with fists, not with shouting. The council meets every week. Everyone may speak. Decisions are made by majority vote. Third, the land belongs to everyone. No one can claim a plot as their own. Houses are built by everyone working together. The harvest is divided equally. Anyone who wants their own plot will get it once Puyon has grown enough for there to be enough land for everyone. People listened. Some nodded. Some frowned. A fisherman who wanted a better house opened his mouth to object. The village elder placed a hand on his shoulder, and he fell silent. The legless veteran raised his hand. He asked who would enforce the rules. Do Jin answered, "Everyone." The veteran smirked. He said he'd seen many such rules, and not a single one had worked without a stick. Do Jin looked at him. He said there would be no stick. There would be something worse. There would be the conscience of 70 people who knew each other by sight. Silence. Then someone laughed. Then someone else. The veteran shook his head but smiled. The rules were accepted. Not unanimously, but accepted. And they worked. Not perfectly, not without friction, but they worked. Because Do Jin didn't just announce the rules. He followed them himself. He ate what everyone else ate. He worked on equal footing with everyone else. He slept in the same guardhouse where he'd woken up on the first day. People saw that, and it had a stronger effect than any stick. Toward the end of the 4th month, So-Rin came to see him one evening. Her expression was serious. She said they needed to talk. They sat by the water. The sunset bathed the marsh in shades of pink and gold. So-Rin said she'd noticed something. She said he flinched when people called him Young Master Kang. That he never drank rice wine, even though everyone else drank it during celebrations. That sometimes at night he spoke in his sleep in a language she didn't know. That his hands didn't move the way an aristocrat's hands should. That he held a shovel like someone who had learned to use it, not like someone who was born with it. She didn't ask who he was, she simply said what she saw, and that she didn't care. Do Jin sat there in silence. Everything inside him tightened. A foreign memory of the former Do Jin rose from the depths. His mother's face, the scent of rice wine, his older brother's voice, tears that didn't belong to Daniel, but that Daniel felt as his own. He looked at So-Rin. He said he was grateful. He said nothing else. So-Rin nodded. She stood up. She walked over to her blueprints. Halfway there, she stopped. Without turning around, she said that the left support in her town hall design, the one he'd called weak on the first day, was indeed weak. She'd checked it 3 times. He was right. She'd corrected it. She said that and left. Do Jin sat by the water and watched the sunset, and he smiled, because he understood. It was her way of saying she trusted him, not with words about feelings, but with words about the foundation. In the 5th month, Yu Jihei arrived. She hadn't come to Puyon on purpose. She'd been here from the very beginning. The village headman's daughter. 19 years old, quiet, unobtrusive, always nearby but always in the shadows. She cooked. She did laundry, she mended clothes, she bandaged cuts, she rocked other people's children. Do Jin saw her every day, and every day he forgot to really look at her. Until one day he did. One of the carpenters cut his hand with an axe. Deeply, blood was gushing. Han Sol was in Taiguan. The nearest doctor was a 3-day journey away. Jihei approached calmly. She washed the wound. She applied a bandage made of clean cloth soaked in something greenish. She stopped the bleeding in a minute. The carpenter turned pale, but the wound stopped bleeding. Do Jin approached and asked what she had soaked the cloth in. Jihei replied quietly, a decoction of willow bark mixed with plantain juice and clay from the West Bank. She'd come up with it herself. She'd tried it on cuts and scrapes. It works. Do Jin watched her. Her hands, confident, precise. Hands that knew what to do before her mind had time to think. He recognized those hands, the hands of a doctor. The next day, he seated her next to Han Sol's laboratory. He led her by the hand. He placed her in front of a table with mortars and flasks. He told her she wasn't a servant. He told her she was a healer. She just didn't know it yet. Ji-hye stood there in silence. Then she lowered her eyes. Then she raised them. Do Jin saw something new in them. Not gratitude, not surprise, recognition. As if she'd finally been told what she'd always known but was afraid to say out loud. Han Sol returned from Taegwan and found her assistant at her desk. At first she snorted. Then she watched Ji-hye grind the herbs. She fell silent. An hour later, they were working together. A day later, Han Sol was teaching her the proper temperatures for boiling bark. A week later, Ji-hye discovered that adding honey to the burn ointment made the wound heal twice as fast. Han Sol looked at her over the top of her pipe. Then, without a word, she moved a chair, her own chair, to the head table. Ji-hye sat down. She had never sat at the head table, in any house, in any room, not once in her life. That evening, she brought Do Jin a bowl of soup, as usual. But the soup was different. Not just rice with greens. 3 kinds of herbs. Mushrooms she'd found growing on willow roots. Thinly sliced linnamen bark for flavor. Do Jin tasted it. He looked at her. He said it was the best soup he'd ever eaten in this world. Ji-hye blushed and left. She didn't see him finish the bowl to the last drop, or the second one. But ever since then, every time he returned from a trip or from the fields, there was a bowl waiting in his room. Always hot. Always with the herbs he needed that very day. How did she know he had a headache? How did she know he hadn't slept all night? How did she know he needed ginger instead of mint? He didn't ask. She didn't explain. By the end of the 5th month, Puyong had a population of 89. 14 houses on stilts, 1 laboratory, 1 workshop, 3 warehouses, 6 rice fields. The camphor trees had grown to the height of 3 people, and the first leaves were ready for harvest. Yoon Mei signed her second contract for indigo, the blue dye from Indigofera. The weavers from the southern city of Hamju offered a price that made her 3 times. She hadn't made a mistake. The indigo from Puyong turned out to be purer and brighter than any other on the market, because Do Jin oversaw every plant from seed to leaf. No impurities, no diseases, a perfect product. Yoon Mei looked at him with an expression he had already learned to recognize. It was the expression of someone counting the money in their head and unable to believe the final total. The money was flowing, slowly but surely. They used it to hire new workers. They bought tools. They ordered iron and fabric. Do Jin spent with the caution of a scientist accustomed to grant funding. Every coin was accounted for. Every expense was justified. At first, Yoon Mei grumbled that he calculated too slowly. Then she admitted that not a single coin had been wasted. She started calling him Mr. Quarterly Report. He didn't object. Toward the end of the 5th month, what everyone had been waiting for and fearing happened. Morning. Dawn. Do Jin stood at the southern plot and did what he did every morning. Hands on the ground, eyes closed, connecting with the roots. And suddenly he sensed that they were ready. The roots. The ancient, dead yet living roots of the underground forest. They had awakened. They remembered. Rumors reached the capital faster than he had anticipated. At the end of the 6th month, a man whom no one had invited arrived in Puyong. Old Master Park Gyung-soo, 3rd-class Imperial Inspector of Land Ranks, a small, gaunt man with a wedge-shaped beard and eyes that missed nothing. Accompanying him were 2 scribes and 4 guards. The guards remained at the gate. The clerks entered behind the master. Master Park stopped in the middle of the square and looked around. Do Jin watched from the porch of the town hall that So-rin had finally begun to build in stone. So far, only the 1st floor walls were standing, but it was already clear that the building would be beautiful. Master Park looked at the houses on stilts, at the rice fields beyond the ditches, at the camphor grove that rose higher than the rooftops, at the river flowing along its old course, glistening in the sun, at the people walking along the paths, working in the fields, and carrying baskets of rice. 112 people. 6 months ago, this had been a swamp without a single living tree. Master Pak turned to his scribes and said something quietly. Both scribes began to scribble. Do Jin came down to him. He bowed briefly, not too low, enough to be polite. Master Pak bowed in return in exactly the same way. 2 men sizing each other up, and both knew it. Master Pak said he had arrived on behalf of the Rank Commission. He said rumors had reached the capital that the commission considered exaggerated. He said his task was to investigate and compile a report. Do Jin nodded. He suggested they tour Puyong. Master Pak agreed. They walked through the village for 3 hours. Do Jin showed him everything: the rice fields, the drainage system, the camphor grove, the indigo plant, the medicinal herb plantation, Han Sol's laboratory, the carpenter's workshop, the warehouses, and the river. Master Park remained silent. He touched the tree trunks and rubbed the soil between his fingers. He sniffed. He tasted the river water. His scribes took notes without stopping. When they reached the camphor grove, Master Pak stopped. He looked at the trees. He looked at Do Jin. He said that these trees appeared to be 5 years old. But according to his records, 6 months ago, the Puyang Marsh had not a single tree taller than a person's knee. Do Jin replied that trees grow quickly when the soil is good. Master Park looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. He jotted something down on his tablet and moved on. By the river, he stopped again. He crouched down. He dipped his hand into the water. He pulled it out. He looked at his wet fingers. He said that according to the commission's documents, the Puyang River was listed as having been destroyed 1,000 years ago. Do Jin replied that the documents were wrong. Master Park didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched. That evening, Do Jin prepared a dinner for the inspector. Not lavish, not meager, precisely calculated. Rice from the Puyang fields, fish from the Puyang River, plums from the Puyang Grove, herbal tea from Han Sol. Every dish from the dead land. Every dish impossible according to the laws Master Park had served all his life. Master Park ate in silence. Then he set down his chopsticks. Then he said that his report would be objective, that he would write what he had seen. What he saw was a village on unranked land with a population of 112 people, with agriculture, with trade, with a river that shouldn't exist, that this would create problems for everyone. Until Jin asked for whom exactly, Master Park listed them. For the Rank Commission, because unranked land cannot be fertile, it contradicts the fundamentals. For the Temple of the 9 Ranks, because if rank does not determine fertility, then the millennia-old dogma is a lie. For the Council of Houses, because if dead land can come to life, then all the exiles of every generation were killed in vain. For Prince Li Hyun personally, because he gave Do Jin a gold vein instead of a grave, and everyone will find out about it. Do Jin listened. Every word struck him like a stone against a wall. He knew all of this. He'd known it from day one. But it's one thing to know, and quite another to hear it from a man who represents that very system. Master Park stood up. He said he would leave in the morning. He said the report would be in the capital in 10 days. He said that after that, Do Jin would have maybe a month, maybe 2. Then those who wouldn't like the report would come. Do Jin stood up and thanked him for his honesty. Master Pak looked at him. He said that honesty was all he had. The rank of his family's lands had been downgraded last year. His wife is sick. Medicines get more expensive with every season. He is neither a friend nor an enemy. He is an official who is tired of lying. Do Jin silently picked up a small bag from the table. He handed it to the inspector. Inside were dried camphor leaves, enough for 3 months of treatment. Master Park looked at the small bag, then at Do Jin. He took it. He bowed, deeply, for the first time during the entire visit. Then he left. In the morning, the inspector departed. Do Jin convened a meeting, with Rin, Yunmei, Han Sol, and the village head, a legless veteran who now led the night watch from a chair that carpenters had made for him. 6 of them sat around the table. Do Jin laid out the situation just as he would have at a meeting in Portland. Clearly, point by point. They had a maximum of 2 months before the capital reacted. The reaction would be one of 3. First, direct military force. Unlikely. Too high profile. Too expensive. A wasteland isn't worth an army. Not yet, anyway. Second, legal strangulation. A confiscation decree. A resettlement decree. A decree granting a new rank that would allow them to take over the city. Most likely. Third, a quiet assassination. Poisoning. An accident. Mercenaries. Possibly. Yunmei nodded. She was thinking the same thing. She said that contracts with the guilds were the first line of defense. If Puyang disappeared, the guilds would lose money. The guilds don't like that. We need more contracts, more connections. We need to become so useful that killing us would cost more than keeping us alive. So Rin said we need walls. Not willow ones, stone ones. Real walls that can be defended. Do Jin fell into thought. Walls are a symbol. Walls say, we're here to stay. But walls are also a provocation. Walls say, we're ready for war. Han Sol smoked her pipe and remained silent. Then she said there was a fourth option, the temple of the 9 ranks. They won't wait for the council's decision. The temple has its own people and its own methods. Her master wasn't tried by the council. He was burned by the temple guards without trial or decree. If the temple decides that Puyang is heresy, they'll be the first to arrive. Silence fell at the table. Do Jin stared at his hands that had tilled the earth and grown trees, hands that didn't know how to wield a sword. He raised his head and said that we were building walls, and at the same time, we were signing new contracts. And at the same time, we were preparing for the possibility that someone would try to kill him. 3 tasks, 3 directions, 2 months. Work began the very next day. So Rin designed the wall, not tall, not thick, but clever. A stone foundation made of granite blocks they'd pulled out of the swamp. On top of the stone, a mud brick wall 2 men tall. On the inside, a platform for sentries. On the outside, a moat filled with water from the river. Then Jin added his own part to her design. Along the outer edge of the moat, he planted a strip of thorny shrubs. Not just any kind. He took a rosehip bush and modified it. Thorns as long as a finger. The stems were as thick as an arm. The roots were so dense that no sapper could dig a tunnel underneath. The thicket grew in a week, dense, impenetrable, and vicious. So Rin looked at it and said it wasn't pretty. Do Jin replied that it was effective though. So Rin thought for a moment and added a row of ornamental cherry trees to the inside of the wall. She said that if there had to be a wall, at least let it bloom in the spring. Do Jin planted the cherry trees. He could have grown ordinary ones, but he remembered that So Rin had once mentioned the willows at her grandmother's house. How, as a child, she used to draw on the ground beneath the willow. The willow at her grandmother's house. The cherry trees by the city wall. Different trees, but the same principle. Every tree is for someone. He planted cherry trees that bloomed white. So-rin loved the color white. She didn't know he remembered that, but when the first petals drifted along the wall in the spring, she stood there watching them for so long that Yoon-mei came to check if something had happened. Meanwhile, Yoon-mei traveled to Taegwon every 10 days. Contracts, connections, names. She wove a trade network like a spider weaves a web. Each thread led to a new partner. Each knot was tighter than the last. The Dyers Guild, the Herbalists Guild, the Boaters Association, which had just learned that the Puyang River was navigable all the way to the sea and back. Every new contract meant a new person who stood to gain from Puyang's prosperity. Yoon-mei kept track of everything on birch bark. Then she ran out of birch bark. Before long, Jin had grown bamboo in a single night, and Han Sol figured out how to make thin sheets out of it for writing. Yoon-mei called it paper. Technically, it wasn't paper but split bamboo, but it worked for writing. Do Jin thought that real paper was still a long way off, but a start had been made. In the 7th month, the first blow came. Not from the direction they were expecting. Old Carpenter Moon, one of the 3 hired hands Yoon-mei had brought with her. The best of the 3. Strong, dependable, a non-drinker, unlike the other 2. He built houses on stilts faster than anyone else. The children loved him because he carved toys for them out of scraps. On the morning of the 7th month, he was found dead. In his room, on his bed. His face was peaceful, as if he'd fallen asleep, but his skin was blue. His lips were black. Han Sol examined the body. She sniffed the cup from which he'd drunk before going to sleep. She lifted her head and looked at Do Jin. Poison. Rare. Expensive. The kind used at court. It takes effect in 2 hours. Tasteless. Odorless. Death in one's sleep. Quiet. Clean. Professional. Do Jin stood by the body and said nothing. A stranger's memory washed over him. The face of the mother of the former Do Jin. She too had died quietly, in her sleep, from an illness, which wasn't an illness. He clenched his fists so tightly that his fingernails dug into his palms. The poison was meant for him. Moon drank from his cup. From the cup that someone had left at the door of his guardhouse with a note from an anonymous well-wisher. Moon had stopped by that evening to discuss the design of the new warehouse. Do Jin wasn't there. Moon saw the cup of wine. He drank it. Do Jin didn't drink rice wine. The killer didn't know that. Or perhaps he did and figured that sooner or later someone would drink it. Han Sol went into the lab and didn't come out for 3 days. When she came out, her eyes were red and she had the results ready. It was a poison derived from the root of a plant that grows only in the Imperial Botanical Garden. Fewer than 20 people in the Empire have access to it. Someone among those 20 had sent the assassin. Do Jin buried Moon on a hill that rose above the west bank of the river. It was the first place in Puyang from which the entire village could be seen. All 112 people came. Do Jin grew an oak tree over the grave, not fast, not young. He poured everything he could into it. 300 years of growth in a single night. Huge. with a canopy that covered half the sky, with roots that reached so deep he could feel the river's stony bed through them. After that, he slept for 2 days. When he woke up, Han Sol was sitting next to him, not at his table, on the floor. She held out a cup to him, not wine, an herbal decoction, bitter, restorative. He drank it. She said she'd found the poisoner, one of the new settlers. He'd arrived 2 weeks ago. He'd introduced himself as a refugee from the northern province, a real refugee with a real story. But among his belongings, Han Sol found a second vial containing the same poison, and a silver coin bearing a coat of arms that a refugee shouldn't have. The coat of arms of House Kang. Do Jin closed his eyes. Tae Woo, his older brother, the one who loved him, the one who betrayed him for his own good, the one who was now sitting in the capital, deciding that the outcast must die quietly, just like their mother. He opened his eyes. He asked where the poisoner was. Han Sol said he was in the warehouse basement, tied up, alive. Do Jin stood up. He staggered. He stood up again. He walked toward the warehouse. The 8th month began with 3 events occurring simultaneously. First, the wall was completed. A stone and mud wall 1,000 paces long encircled Puyang in a semicircle from river to river. On the western side were a moat and thorny bushes. On the eastern side, the river served as a natural barrier. There were 2 gates, the northern one leading to the road to Taekwon, and the southern one leading to the river pier that So-rin had designed while the wall was being built. Puyang was no longer just a village. Puyang had become a small fortified town. Second, Yunmei signed a contract with the Boatmen's Guild. The Puyang River turned out to be navigable all the way to the coast. It took 4 days to travel downstream and 2 days to return with a tailwind. The boatmen brought back the first shipment from the coast: salt, iron, cloth, fishing nets, and a letter from the Merchants Guild of the coastal city of Haeju. The guild expressed interest in trading with Puyang and offered to discuss the terms. Yunmei read the letter 3 times. Then she looked at Do Jin with that expression he already knew, the expression of someone who can count money faster than they can blink. A 3rd time. A caravan appeared on the eastern highway. Not a merchant caravan, a military one. 50 horsemen, banners bearing a coat of arms that Do Jin recognized before he could even make it out clearly. The Mo House, a neighboring aristocratic family. The landowners to the east of Puyang. 6th rank lands, not wealthy, not poor, but growing poorer every year because the commission had downgraded the rank of their lands from 5th 2 years ago. The House of Mo was losing peasants. The peasants were fleeing. Some of them fled to Puyang, and the House of Mo had come after them. At the head of the caravan rode a young man in expensive armor, Mo Chang-ho, heir to the House of Mo, 25 years old, broad shoulders, a strong jaw, the eyes of a man accustomed to having his way. He stopped at the north gate and demanded that it be opened. The sentry on the wall looked down. He looked at the 50 horsemen. He ran to find Do Jin. Do Jin climbed onto the wall. He looked down at Mo Chang-ho. Mo Chang-ho looked up. He demanded the return of his peasants, the 23 families who had left the lands of the House of Mo without permission. According to imperial law, a runaway peasant belongs to the owner of the land where he was born. By law, Do Jin was obligated to return them. Do Jin stood on the wall and thought. The law was clear. The law was on Mo Chang-ho's side. But the law also stated that the dead land had no legal status, and that meant there was no law at all on the dead land. Neither imperial law, nor feudal law, nor divine law. The dead land was a hole in the empire's legal fabric. Everything that happened there did not exist in the eyes of the law. This worked both ways. The Mo household could not file a complaint with the Council of Houses because the council did not recognize the existence of Puyang. But Do Jin could not appeal to the council for protection either. He was invisible, a ghost with a population of 120 people. Do Jin leaned toward Mo Chang-ho. He spoke calmly. He said that the peasants had come of their own free will. He said they were better off here than on the lands of the Mo house. He said that if Mo Chang-ho wanted them back, he should offer them terms better than those Puyang was offering. 2 harvests a year, a home, food, no taxes, and medical care. If the Mo house could offer more, let the peasants decide for themselves. Mo Chang-ho flushed red. He wasn't used to bargaining with exiles. He was used to the sword. He gave the order. 50 horsemen turned and rode along the wall, not toward the gate, but along the moat. They weren't going to storm it. They were going to go around it, find a weak spot, get in. Do Jin climbed down from the wall. He headed for the south gate. He stepped outside the wall, alone. Rin ran after him. He raised his hand without turning around. Stop. She stopped. He walked toward the riverbank to where the thorny thicket ended and the open water began, the spot where the horsemen could cross. He stood by the water. He lowered his hands. His palms touched the wet earth. He reached toward the river, toward the roots at the bottom, toward those very ancient roots he had awakened, and he asked them. He didn't command them, he asked. Stems began to rise from the water, not willow stems, others, thick as logs, intertwined like ropes, the water roots of ancient trees that had grown on the banks of the Puyan River 1,000 years ago. They rose from the water slowly, with a sloshing and cracking sound. They intertwined with one another. They formed a wall, a living wall of roots and stems, 2 human heights tall, stretching from bank to bank. Impassable for horses, impassable for people. Mo Chang-ho's horsemen stopped at the bank. The horses backed away and whinnied. The men fell silent. They stared at the wall of roots that had sprung up out of nowhere in 3 minutes. Mo Chang-ho rode up to Do Jin. His face was pale. He wasn't afraid. He was angry. But he saw what he saw. And he understood that 50 horsemen would not be able to pass through something that was growing faster than they could ride. Do Jin turned to him. He said he did not want war. He said that Puyang traded, not waged war. He said that if the House of Mo wished, Puyang was ready to sell them rice at a fair price. That medicinal herbs were available. That camphor oil cured the coughs afflicting children in the 6th-rank lands because the soil was depleted and the water was dirty. He wasn't threatening. He was making an offer. And that angered Mo Chang-ho more than any threats. Mo Chang-ho turned his horse around. 50 horsemen turned around after him. They rode off along the eastern road, in silence. Do Jin stood by the river until they disappeared over the horizon. Then his legs gave way, and he sank into the mud. The root wall had taken a heavy toll, more than he had expected. His hands were shaking. His vision was growing dark. So-rin ran up to him. She grabbed him by the shoulders. He looked at her and tried to smile. He said that they now had a natural defense from the south. So-rin replied that they now also had an idiot who fainted every time he tried to be a hero. He laughed. Then he collapsed after all. He slept through half the day. When he woke up, a bowl of soup was standing next to him. Ji-hei, ginger and mint, just what he needed. Mo Chang-ho hadn't returned. But Do Jin knew it was only temporary. The Mo house would wait, gather allies, look for other ways. Brute force hadn't worked, so it would take cunning. A week later, Yun Mei confirmed his fears. She returned from Taeguan with news. The Mo house is negotiating with the Huang house, 3rd rank, a formidable force, lands north of Puyan. Together, they have enough influence to submit a petition to the Council of Houses. A petition alleging that Puyan is illegally harboring fugitive peasants and conducting trade without a license. Legal strangulation. The second option out of 3. Do Jin nodded. Yun Mei continued, but there's also good news. The Taeguan Guild doesn't want to lose a supplier. They've offered to act as a mediator. If Puyang agrees to pay the guild a trade fee, the guild will provide legal cover. All goods from Puyang will formally pass through Taeguan, as if they were produced not by the Deadlands, but by a legitimate trading house. A gray area, semi-legal, but it works. Do Jin thought it over for 3 days. Then he agreed. Yun Mei left to handle the paperwork. She returned with documents bearing 7 seals, the Ryers Guild, the Herbalists Guild, the Boatmen's Association, and the Heiju Chamber of Commerce. 3 private merchants whom Yun Mei knew personally. 7 seals. 7 threads of the web that kept Puyang afloat. The 9th month. The population had surpassed 150. New people arrived every week, so Rin couldn't keep up with building. Do Jin couldn't keep up with planting. Han Sol couldn't keep up with treating patients. Yun Mei couldn't keep up with counting. They needed specialists, not just hands, minds, a blacksmith, a potter, a weaver, a teacher for the children, of whom there were already more than 30 in Puyan. Yun Mei found a blacksmith in Taeguan, an old drunkard who'd been expelled from the guild for smelting iron his own way. His method produced steel better than the standard, but it violated guild rules. In Puyan, there were no guild rules. The blacksmith arrived and looked around the workshop. He looked at the river water, which was ideal for quenching. He looked at the willow charcoal, which burned hotter than usual. He took off his apron. He put on his apron.
veteran. He began to work. A week later, Puyon had his own nails. 2 weeks later, his own hinges and locks. 3 weeks later, his first plow. Do Jin stood by the forge and watched the blacksmith work. He remembered how, in Portland, he'd order lab equipment from a catalog, and it would arrive in 3 days. Here, every nail was born of fire and sweat, and every nail was more valuable than 100 from a catalog. The 10th month. Do Jin stood on the town hall balcony and looked out over the city. Early morning. Fog was rising from the river. Smoke from the blacksmith shop rose in a steady column. People were already working in the rice fields. 220 people. A living city on dead land. He rested his hands on the stone railing and leaned out. Through the stone, through the foundation, through the clay and silt to the very base. And he felt what he had felt every morning for the past 2 months. A presence. Something beneath Puyon. Deep beneath the foundations of the ancient city. Deeper than the roots. Deeper than the riverbed. It did not move. It wasn't growing. It wasn't dying. It was waiting. He pulled his hands back. Every time he reached too deep, that presence grew brighter, like light behind a closed door. He didn't know what it was. He only knew that it was connected to ancient Puyon.
To what the emperor's priests had wanted to hide 1,000 years ago. The curse wasn't a punishment. The curse was a cover. He stepped back from the railing. Not now. The city first. The people first. Yunmei was waiting for him downstairs with bamboo tablets. Quarterly report. She had learned that phrase and used it at every opportunity. Revenue from camphor oil had tripled. Indigo was stable. Fabric from Puyon sold for more in Haeju than the local kind. There was more rice than needed for domestic consumption. The surplus could be sold, or traded for things they lacked. Glass, books, good quality paper. Do Jin listened and nodded. Then he said he needed cotton seeds. Yunmei raised an eyebrow. Cotton grows far to the south. It's too cold here. Do Jin said that was his problem. Her problem was to find the seeds. Yunmei smiled and made a note of it. She didn't ask why anymore. She'd seen camphor trees in climates where they weren't supposed to grow. She'd seen cinnamon trees on marshy soil. She'd seen indigo plants that bloomed twice as brightly as those in the south. If this man says he'll grow cotton in a swamp, then he'll grow it. Her job was to bring the seeds. His task was to do the impossible. Division of labor. That same morning, news arrived that would change the next 6 months. A boatman from Haeju brought a letter. Not from the guild, not from the merchants. From a man who introduced himself as a friend of the late Master Kyung Sik, Master Han Sol. The letter was brief. The Temple of the 9 Ranks knows about Puyon. The temple has declared the land impure. Not dead, impure. The difference is enormous. Dead land is emptiness. Impure land is defilement. Dead land is ignored. Impure land is purified. Purification, as understood by the temple, meant fire. Han Sol read the letter. She folded it neatly. She placed it on the table. She lit her pipe. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't tremble. She said that the temple would send purifying priests. She said she had seen their work. A village in the north. 200 people. The priests decided the land was defiled because the peasants had prayed to the old gods. They burned the village to the ground. They didn't harm the people. They simply left them without homes, without fields, without food, in the middle of winter. 4 survived. Do Jin listened. His face was stony. Inside, everything was burning. He didn't believe in the gods of this world. He didn't believe in ranks as a divine order. For him, it was chemistry and soil science. But for the temple, it was faith. And a faith under threat is more dangerous than any army. He convened a council. He outlined the threat. So Rin turned pale. Yunmei clenched her teeth. The village head bowed his head. Jihei clenched her fists under the table. The legless veteran cursed. Do Jin didn't let panic take hold. He said they had the upper hand. The temple moved slowly, the bureaucracy of rituals, the commission for determining impurity, a vote by the council of elders, the appointment of purifiers, at least 3 months. Yunmei said that in 3 months she would make Puyon so valuable that burning it down would be political suicide. Do Jin nodded. Han Sol said she had friends among the temple's junior priests. Not everyone believes in the dogma. Some have doubts. She could write to them, ask them to stall for time from the inside. Do Jin nodded. So Rin said that if they had to defend themselves, City Hall would withstand a siege. Stone walls, a stone foundation, a supply of water from an underground spring that Do Jin found beneath the building. Do Jin said it wouldn't come to a siege. He said he had an idea that would either save Puyon or hasten its destruction. He didn't explain what it was. He said he needed time, a week. Then he'd show them. They went their separate ways. Do Jin was left alone. He sat in City Hall and thought. There had been a similar case in Portland. The city council had wanted to shut down their project to restore the contaminated site. Too dangerous, too unpredictable, too much against the rules. Daniel did one thing back then. He invited the council to the site. He showed them a blooming meadow where a landfill used to be. He showed them the clear water in a stream that had been poisonous 3 years earlier. He showed them children playing on the grass where only poisonous weeds had once grown. The council voted unanimously to continue. Show, don't tell, show. He began working at night. Every night for a whole week. He would go beyond the wall into the darkness and work the soil. No one knew what he was doing. Rin tried to follow him. He asked her not to go. She obeyed, with difficulty. On the 7th day, he returned at dawn, dirty, staggering, with blood on his palms where his calluses had burst, but smiling. He gathered everyone, all 220 people. He asked them to go out through the south gate and look. They went out and fell silent. Beyond the south wall, on a plot that a week ago had been a barren swamp, stood a garden. No, not a garden, a park, trees, bushes, flowers, white stone paths, a small pond with clear water where lilies floated, and in the middle of it all, a clearing covered with grass so green that it glowed in the morning mist. The trees were young, 2 or 3 years old it seemed, but they were already in bloom. Cherry trees, plum trees, pear trees, peach trees, white and pink petals swirled through the air. The land that the imperial priests had cursed 1,000 years ago was blooming as if the curse had never existed. Do Jin stood at the park's entrance and looked at the faces. The children ran in first. The women followed. The men stood and watched. The village elder sat down on a white rock by the path and covered his face with his hands. He was crying. An old man who had watched the land die his entire life. He had seen the fields dry up. He had seen the trees wither. He had seen the ranks fall, and with them, hope. And now he sat in the blooming park on the dead land and wept because the land was alive. Do Jin approached him. He sat down beside him. He said quietly that this wasn't for the temple, it was for them. For all 220 of them. So they would remember why they were here. Then he turned to So-rin. He said that the park was part of the plan. Every guest who came to Pyongyang would pass through this park. Every inspector, every official, every priest. Let them see it. Let them try to call it wicked. Let them try to explain to their believers why cherry blossoms are impure. So-rin looked at the park, then at him. Then she said the paths were crooked. He laughed. She didn't smile. But the next day, she came with a blueprint for new paths for the park. Perfect ones. Do Jin rearranged the stones according to her lines. Yunmei looked at the park and saw something else. She saw that every tree was a commodity. Cherries are berries. Plums are jam. Peaches are the most expensive fruit at the capital's market. Pears are medicinal syrup. Do Jin shook his head. He said that this park wasn't for sale. There are things more valuable than money. Yunmei opened her mouth. She closed it. She thought for a moment. Then she said quietly that for the first time in her life, she was seeing an aristocrat who spoke worse of money than a merchant. It was a compliment. At least, that's what Do Jin decided. The 11th month. The second blow. Not poison. Not the army. A letter. A letter from Kang Tae-woo, his older brother. Delivered by an official courier bearing the seal of the House of Kang. So Rin brought it to City Hall. She placed it on the table in front of Do Jin. He stared at the seal. Red wax. The 12th month. A year. 1 year since the day Daniel Kang from Portland woke up in a swamp in a stranger's body, with an imperial scroll and not a single boot to his name. 365 days, 247 residents, 32 houses, town hall, blacksmith shop, weaving workshop, laboratory, apothecary storehouse. A school for children organized by a former teacher who had fled the province after his school was shut down for teaching in a manner that did not conform to temple canons. A dock for 6 boats, 4 trade contracts, 7 types of goods for export, a river, a park, a wall, and a 300-year-old oak on the hill that bloomed every spring. Even though oaks don't bloom like that, this one did, because Do Jin asked it to. Do Jin stood on the town hall balcony and counted. Not money, people. He remembered every single one, every name, every story. The village elder with calloused hands, the legless veteran who now commanded the night watch from a wheelchair that a blacksmith had made for him, the widow with 3 children whose children no longer coughed, the weaver whose blue fabrics were sold in 3 cities, the blacksmith who sang old war songs while he worked. 247 stories, 247 reasons why Pyongyang could not die. He went downstairs. Today was a special day, the first harvest festival. Yunmei had insisted. She said that people needed a festival, that work without a festival was slavery, not life. Do Jin agreed, and he began preparing a week in advance. Every evening he would go into the grove and work, quietly, alone.
On the morning of the festival, the entire square in front of City Hall was covered in petals, white and pink. The oak tree on the hill was in such full bloom that it looked like a cloud. The river carried the petals downstream, and the fisherman in Haeju later said that the water had turned pink for the whole day. But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was what Do Jin did instead of giving a throne speech. He stepped out onto the square with a woven basket, a large one, heavy, full of fruit, and he began to hand them out, to every resident, personally. One piece of fruit each, a pear to the old carpenter, soft, sweet.
Because his teeth were bad and he could only eat soft things. An orphan girl got a peach. She had never tasted a fresh peach. The look on her face when she took her first bite. Dejin remembered that face forever. To Rin, he gave a tart green apple. She didn't like sweet things. She took the apple and looked at him, then at the apple, then back at him. She took a bite. She nodded. A good apple. To Yunmei, he gave a pomegranate. She had mentioned once, 3 months ago, that she hadn't tasted a fresh pomegranate since her family went bankrupt. One sentence, thrown out in passing. He remembered it. She took the pomegranate, held it with both hands, for a long time. Then she raised her head and looked at him from the crowd, and for the first time in her life, Yunmei, who counted money faster than she breathed, realized that wealth is when people remember you. He didn't give Han Sol anything, because last night he had planted a night-blooming jasmine bush under the window of her lab. She couldn't sleep without the scent herbs. In the morning, she opened the window and stood there for 5 minutes, breathing it in. Then she closed the window. Then she opened it again. Do Jin saw this from the town hall balcony. He didn't come over. He didn't say anything. To Jihei, he gave a handful of dried rose hips, sour, medicinal. She looked at him with that expression he'd never quite learned to read. Then she smiled, quietly, like someone who'd received exactly what they wanted, even though they'd never asked for it. That evening, she left a bowl of soup at his door, with those very same berries, pureed into the broth. He understood. She'd returned the gift, reimagined it, made it better. That's how she did everything. 247 fruits, 247 preferences. He remembered every single one. Yunmei later counted them and said it was impossible. One person couldn't possibly remember 247 tastes from 247 people. Do Jin replied that it wasn't memory, it was attention. Yunmei looked at him. Then she turned away quickly. Too quickly. So Rin noticed. Han Sol noticed. Jihei noticed. No one said anything. Li Hua hadn't arrived yet. Do Jin didn't yet know that a princess would soon appear in his life. But right now, standing in the square amid the petals and laughter, he was happy. Not Daniel, not Do Jin, just a man who had built a place where people felt at ease. The celebration lasted until nightfall. Fish, rice, plums, beer that the blacksmith had secretly brewed from barley, which turned out to be surprisingly decent. Children ran about. The elderly sat by the fire. A weaver sang an old song. Some danced. Some wept with happiness. An ordinary celebration of ordinary people. The first in their lives on land that belonged to them. Do Jin wasn't drinking. He sat by the river. He listened to the celebration behind him. He was thinking. A year ago, he was dead. Or alive in another world. Or asleep at the wheel of a pickup truck on a highway at night. Now he was sitting on the bank of the river he had brought back to life. In the town he had built. Among people who believed in him. A strange life. Someone else's life. His life. Rin came over. She sat down next to him, silently. They sat and looked at the water. She said the town hall looked good, that the foundation hadn't settled even a finger's width, that the left support, which she'd fixed based on his suggestion, held up better than the right one. He nodded. She said she wanted to build a bridge across the river, a stone one, with 3 arches. He said, "We'll build it." She nodded. They were silent for a while. Then she stood up and went to the celebration. He stayed by the river. Han Sol found him an hour later. She brought him a pipe, not hers, a second one. She handed it to him. He looked at it. She shrugged. She said the herbs in this pipe weren't tobacco, a soothing blend, lavender and mint. It helps you think. He took it, took a drag. Lavender and mint, a taste that belonged to none of his worlds. A new taste for a new life. Han Sol sat down beside him. She smoked her own pipe. She was silent. Then she said she'd found something in Master Kyung-sik's old notes. Before his death, her teacher had been studying the history of the Puyan curse. He'd found a reference in the temple archives which he had access. A mention that the land of Puyan was cursed, not because its inhabitants had sinned, but because beneath the city lay something the temple feared. Something the priest called the root of the first rank. Do Jin froze.
The root of the first rank, she continued. According to Master Kyung-sik's records, the ranking system wasn't created by humans, it was copied. 1,000 years ago, the priests found something in the ground beneath Puyan, something alive, something that made the land fertile without rituals or prayers, something natural, and they were frightened, because if the land could be fertile without the temple, then what was the point of the temple? They destroyed the city, they buried what they had found.
They built the rank system to control what had once been free. For 1,000 years, the temple had been selling to people what the earth gave for free. Do Jin sat there, breathing, the first rank root. He could feel it every day, the presence beneath Puyon, alive, waiting. He didn't know what it was. Now he knew its name. Han Sol took a long drag on her pipe. She said that Master Kyung-sik had died because of it, not for heresy, for knowledge, for getting too close to the secret that had sustained the temple for 1,000 years. Do Jin nodded. He asked if anyone else knew. Han Sol shook her head. She was the only one who had the master's records. She kept them in a glass vial sealed with wax, her only inheritance. Do Jin asked to see them. She pulled a small scroll from her bosom. She held it out. He unrolled it. The handwriting was small and hurried. Diagrams, schematics, fragments of text copied from the temple archives. And at the very bottom, a drawing. Rough, but recognizable. A gigantic root system. Not a tree, not a bush. Something else. Something that grew not upward but downward, into the depths, and from which threads radiated. Thousands of threads, in all directions, beneath the entire continent. Do Jin stared at the drawing, and he understood. A system of ranks. The first rank was closer to the center, the ninth was farther out. The Deadlands at the very edge. Not because the gods had decided so, but because the threads of this root didn't reach the edges. The land was fertile not by the grace of the temple. The land was fertile because a gigantic living network lived beneath it. The first rank root, mycorrhiza, a fungal network. He knew that word. He'd studied it for 3 years in Portland. The mycorrhizal network, an underground fungal network that connects trees and plants. It transfers nutrients, water, information. In his world, it was called the Wood Wide Web, the forest's internet. Here, it was the same thing, only 1,000 times larger, 1,000 times older, 1,000 times more powerful. Not a forest, a continent, a fungal network the size of a continent, alive, ancient, sealed beneath Puyon because this was its central hub. The 13th month, the beginning of the second year. Winter came late and gently. Puyon turned out to be in a fortunate spot. The river tempered the frost. The willow grove broke the wind. The camphor trees held the warmth in their thickets like living stoves. Jin hadn't planned this, or perhaps he had. He could no longer distinguish an engineer's intuition from the whisper of his gift. Every tree he planted took root exactly where it was meant to be. Not by his will, but by the logic of an ecosystem that knew itself better than he did. Work slowed down in the winter. Building in the cold is hard. Planting was pointless. Even his gift fell silent when the ground froze over. But the people didn't sleep. The weaver worked. The blacksmith forged. Khan Sol brewed potions. So Rin sketched. All winter long she drew. Not one house, not two, an entire city. Puyan as it would be in 5 years. Streets, neighborhoods, the market, the port, bridges, a temple. Not the temple of the 9 ranks, another temple, for another faith. Or without any faith at all. Just a beautiful building on the riverbank where people would come when they needed silence. She showed the blueprints to Do Jin in the middle of winter. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked up. He asked why the streets curved in arcs instead of running straight. She replied that straight streets were for armies. People who aren't in a hurry walk in arcs. He nodded. He asked why the market was in the center and the port on the outskirts. She replied that the market is the heart of the city. The port is the hands. The heart is inside. The hands are outside. He nodded again. He asked why his guardhouse wasn't on the drawing. She replied that he would be moving into the house she had designed for him. He asked which one. She pointed. A small house by the river. 1 story. Stone. With a garden that led right down to the water. With a wide window facing east. With a workshop in the basement. Do Jin looked at the blueprint of the house and thought that So Rin hadn't just drawn a house. She had drawn a place where a man who wakes up early and touches the earth first thing in the morning could live. The east-facing window for the morning light. The garden by the river for working with aquatic plants. The basement, a workshop for experiments. She knew his daily routine. She knew his habits. She had seen him every day for a whole year and had drawn a house for him. Not for Mr. Puyan, for him. He looked at her. She was looking at the blueprint, a pencil behind her ear, clay on her fingers. He said the house was beautiful. She nodded. She said she knew. Winter was over. Spring came early, and with spring came Yim Li. She arrived in Puyan in the 14th month. On the first warm day when the river thawed and the boats began traveling upstream again, she arrived on a trading boat from Haeju, a young woman dressed in men's clothing. Her hair was cut short, her hands were calloused, her eyes were wary. She introduced herself as a master mechanic. She said she'd heard about Puyan, about the water mills they were building here, about the forge with its unusual steel, about the city on the marsh. Yunmei brought her to Do Jin. He received her at City Hall, the usual conversation, where she was from, what she could do, why she had come. Yumli answered calmly. From the northern province, a merchant's daughter. Her parents had died. She knew how to repair mechanisms. She'd come looking for work. Do Jin nodded. A typical story, one of hundreds. Then he took her to the water mill on the river. The mill was malfunctioning. The wheel turned unevenly. The grain was being ground in fits and starts. He struggled with it for 2 weeks. So Rin helped with the design. The blacksmith forged new parts. Nothing helped. Do Jin stood by the mill, cursing, quietly, under his breath, in English. Yumli stood nearby and listened. Then she quietly replied in the same language. Try changing the gear ratio. He froze, turned around, looked at her. She was looking at him. Silence. The river roared. The mill creaked. The world around them carried on as usual. Yet something hung between them, something neither of them had felt since the transfer. Recognition. He asked in English, "Who are you?" She replied in English, "Emily Zhang Sokolova, Seattle, mechanical engineer, 3 years in this world, alone." He stood there, breathing. 3 years. She'd been here for 3 years. Alone. Without explanations. Without help. Without a single person who understood where she came from. 3 years of pretending. 3 years of silence. 3 years without hearing her native language. He asked, "How?" She replied briefly, "A cargo accident. Darkness. A foreign body. The daughter of a merchant from the northern province. The merchant was killed by bandits. The family was wiped out. She survived. She learned to survive. She repaired her first lock in exchange for food. She repaired her first wagon in exchange for a place to stay. She repaired her first loom in exchange for a spot in a workshop. 3 years, from town to town, from workshop to workshop. Then she heard about Puyan. About a strange aristocrat who was building a city on a swamp and saying things that sounded like they were from another world. She didn't come for work, she came to check it out. He told her his name, Daniel Kang, Portland, soil science. She closed her eyes, opened them. They were wet. She wasn't crying, her eyes were just wet. He wasn't crying either. They stood by a broken mill on the riverbank in a world without electricity, without the internet, without airplanes, without coffee, and without everything they'd grown accustomed to in their former lives. And they were silent. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than words. They talked all night. They sat in his tent and talked. In English. For the first time in a year, he spoke English out loud instead of just in his head. The words flowed easily and painfully at the same time, like blood in a numb hand. He told her everything. The transfer, the gift, the swamp, Puyan, the people, the land, the route. She listened. Then she told her story. Her transfer had been harsher. The merchant's daughter's body had been beaten. Broken ribs, a battered face. She hadn't been able to walk for 3 months. She'd nursed herself back to health. She'd learned to live in a world where a woman with an engineer's mindset is either a witch or a madwoman. She was neither. She was a person who fixes things. By morning, they hadn't slept, but they weren't tired either. Or perhaps they were tired but didn't notice. Yumli looked at him in the dawn light. She said he had a nice town. She said she was staying. She said she'd fix the mill by tomorrow. She fixed it. The gear ratio was wrong. She replaced the gear that the blacksmith had forged according to her blueprint in 3 hours. The mill ran smoothly. The grain started flowing. So Rin came over and looked at the mill. She looked at Yumli. She looked at Do Jin. She didn't say a word, but the pencil tucked behind her ear twitched. Yunmei came over later. She looked too. She didn't say a word either, but she jotted down in her notes that Puyan now had a chief engineer. Han Sol didn't come over. She watched from the laboratory window. She was smoking a pipe. When Do Jin came to see her that evening, she said just one thing. She said that his eyes were exactly like the new girl's. Not the color, not the shape, the expression. The expression of people who had been lost and found. Do Jin didn't reply. Yumli became part of Puyan quickly, faster than anyone before her. Because she didn't just work, she thought like Do Jin, in systems. The 15th month, spring of the 2nd year. The river carried meltwater and petals from the park. Puyan was breathing. 312 people, a city that didn't exist on the empire's map, but which every merchant from the coast to the capital knew about. Do Jin stood on the pier and watched as they unloaded the third boat of the morning. Fabric from Haeju, glass from the south, 3 barrels of iron ore, and a guest. Standing on board the last boat was a person in a silk traveling cloak embroidered with the imperial family's crest. Not an official, not an inspector, a woman. Young, back straight, her chin held high. Her face was beautiful and cold, like a porcelain mask. Behind her were 4 maids and 2 guards. Princess Li Hua, the younger sister of Prince Li Hyun, the very same prince whom the former Do Jin had slapped for insulting his mother. Yunmei recognized the crest first. She turned pale. She approached Do Jin and whispered that this was bad, very bad. Having a princess at court was a political gesture, an honorary hostage, a living reminder that the imperial house was watching, a living threat that must not be touched. Do Jin watched the princess as she descended the steps without looking where she was going. A maid held out her hand. The princess did not take it. She stepped onto the pier. She looked around. Her expression did not change. No surprise, no interest, no disgust. The perfect mask of a courtier who knows how to hide their feelings in public. She approached Do Jin. She held out a scroll. He took it. He unrolled it. A decree in the name of Crown Prince Li Hyun. Princess Li Hua is to travel to Puyan as the prince's personal representative to oversee the development of the territory. An honorary appointment. Indefinite term. Do Jin read it and understood every word between the lines. This wasn't an appointment. It was an exile. The prince had sent his sister to the swamplands as a humiliation disguised as an honor. Why? Because she was getting in his way, or because he wanted eyes and ears in Puyan, or both. Do Jin rolled up the decree. He looked at the princess. He asked her one thing. He asked what she liked to eat. Li Hua blinked. For the first time ever, her face twitched. She hadn't expected that question. Her mask cracked for a moment. She answered, "Peonies. Not to eat. She loves peonies. They don't grow south of the capital." Do Jin nodded. He ordered So-rin to prepare a room in City Hall, the best one, with a window overlooking the river. So-rin raised an eyebrow but went to do as she was told. That evening, Do Jin went out through the south gate into the park. He knelt by the pond and dug his hands into the soil. Peonies don't grow at this latitude. It's too warm, too humid, different soil, different light. He took a handful of soil and began to work. He adjusted the acidity. He set up the drainage. He drew upon everything he knew about peonies from memory, not much. He was a soil scientist, not a florist, but he knew soil, and the soil knew flowers. He found seeds in the silt that had been waiting, ancient ones, not peonies but close relatives, the wild ancestors of what, after 1,000 years of selective breeding, had become a court flower. He took their ancient resilience and infused it into the peony seeds that Yunmei had brought from Taegwan at his request back in the winter. He had been waiting for this moment, without knowing why. Now he knew. By dawn, a peony garden was in bloom beneath the window of the princess's room. White, pink, scarlet. Heavy buds bowed under their own weight. The fragrance wafted toward the window. Li Hua awoke. She walked to the window. She opened it. She stood there for a long time. Then she closed it. Then she opened it again. Then she sat down on the floor and remained there until noon. A maid came to call her to breakfast. The princess was sitting on the floor looking out the window. Her eyes were dry, her face was calm, but her hands were clenching the hem of her dress so tightly that the fabric had turned white. Do Jin didn't approach her. He didn't ask any questions. He simply planted the flowers. Let them speak for themselves. The first week passed in silence. Li Hua would leave her room. She would walk around the city. She would look around. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't ask questions. The maids scurried after her. Guards stood at the doors. The residents of Puyan glanced at her and gave her a wide berth. A princess, of imperial blood, a stranger here, dangerous. On the 8th day, she went to the kitchen, the communal kitchen under a canopy where 3 women cooked for the entire city. She stood in the doorway, watching as the women kneaded dough for flatbreads. One of the women looked back and nearly dropped her bowl. Li Hua said she wanted to learn how to bake bread. Silence. The women exchanged glances. A princess, of imperial blood. She wants to knead dough. Jihei approached. She looked at the princess, at her white hands, at her silk dress. Then, without a word, she handed her an apron. Li Hua put the apron on over her silk dress. She rolled up her sleeves. She stood at the table. Jihei showed her how to knead. Li Hua tried. The dough stuck to her fingers. She frowned. She tried again. It stuck again. Jihei placed her hands over the princess's and demonstrated the motion. Slowly, gently. Don't press down, roll it. Li Hua repeated the motion. The dough came together properly. She looked at her hands covered in flour and smiled. A small, crooked smile. Her first genuine smile since arriving in Puyon. Do Jin saw it from the town hall window. He turned to So-rin, who was standing next to the blueprints for the new bridge, and said that the princess would stay. So-rin asked how he knew. He said that a person who smiles while kneading dough doesn't want to leave. So-rin looked down at the princess in her apron over her silk gown. Then at Do Jin. Then at the blueprints. She said nothing. She added a bakery to the city plan. Li Hua was changing, slowly, layer by layer, like the earth that Do Jin was draining. First, the water receded. Then the clay was exposed. Then, beneath the clay, there was stone. Beneath the princess's mask was a girl who secretly read peasant songs, who dreamed of her hands smelling of flour rather than incense, who had spent her whole life as a piece on someone else's board and had, for the first time, found herself in a place where no one else was playing. She began to speak, first with Jihei, then with the women in the kitchen, then with the children who didn't know she was a princess and simply called her Aunt Hua. The 16th month, the summer of the second year. Puyon's population had surpassed 400. A second bridge across the river, a market in the central square, the weaver's quarter, the herbalist's quarter, a school for 50 children, 3 boats in their own fleet. Yunmei traded with 5 cities. Han Sol treated not only Puyon, but also 3 neighboring villages. So-rin built non-stop. Yunli modified everything she could get her hands on. Jihei headed the pharmacy workshop and trained 4 apprentices. Li Hua baked bread in the mornings and secretly helped Yunmei with diplomatic correspondence because the princess knew the court language like no one else. The city was alive, the city was growing, and the city was attracting attention. In the 17th month, news arrived from Yunmei in Taiguan. The Council of Houses had scheduled a hearing. House Mo and House Huang had filed a joint petition. The charges? Illegal harboring of fugitive peasants, trading without a license, construction of fortifications without the council's permission, usurpation of rights to the waterway, and the most dangerous of all, sorcery. The use of forbidden arts to alter the nature of the land, circumventing the established divine order of ranks. The last charge came from the temple. Han Sol was right. The temple had arrived. Not with fire, with paper, which is worse. Fire can be extinguished. Paper must be contested. And to contest a charge of sorcery in a world where the temple decides what is sorcery and what is not. Impossible. Or nearly impossible. Do Jin convened a council, a full council, with Rin, Yunmei, Han Sol, Yumli, Jihei, Li Hua, the village elder, the legless veteran, the blacksmith, the weaver, 12 people at the table, for the first time. Do Jin laid out the situation. The hearing is in 2 months, the Council of Houses in the capital. Do Jin has no right to speak because the owner of the dead land is stripped of his vote in the council. He will be tried in absentia. He cannot defend himself. Silence. Then Li Hua spoke, quietly, steady, with the voice of someone who grew up in the throne room and knows every crack in every wall. She said that Do Jin cannot speak, but she can. She is a princess. She has the right to speak, not fully. Women of the imperial family may speak only in response to a direct question. But if any member of the council asks her a question about Puyon, she will answer, and her answer will carry weight. Yunmei picked up on this. She said she had contacts among the merchant representatives on the council. Merchants do not vote, but they have the right to present economic evidence. If the Taiguan and Heiju guilds confirm that Puyon is a legitimate trading partner, the accusation of illegal trade will fall apart. Han Sol said that the accusation of witchcraft was the most dangerous and the most vulnerable, because even the temple itself doesn't know what Do Jin is doing. They call it witchcraft because they can't explain it. If we show them that this isn't sorcery but knowledge, if we prove that the earth changes according to the laws of nature and not by the will of demons. Do Jin raised his hand. Everyone fell silent. He said there was only one way, to show them, not to tell, not to argue, not to prove, to show. He suggested inviting the council to Pyongyang. Everyone, every member of the council, every inspector, every priest, let them come, let them see, let them touch the earth, let them taste the rice, let them walk through the park, let them look into the eyes of the 400 people who live on land that, according to their laws, does not exist, and then let them try to call it witchcraft. Li Hua said it was madness, that the council would never go to the dead land, that it was beneath their dignity. Do Jin smiled. He said the council would go, because they're curious, because rumors about Pyongyang have been circulating in the capital for a year and a half, and each of them wants to see it with their own eyes, and because refusing to come would look like fear. And aristocrats fear fear more than they fear the enemy. They arrived on the first day of fall, 12 carriages, mounted guards, the banners of the 5 great houses, gold on the harnesses, silk draped over their shoulders. The Council of Houses of the Hoguk Empire traveled along a road that hadn't existed a year and a half ago, past fields that had been swampland a year and a half ago, through gates that had been an empty riverbank a year and a half ago. Do Jin met them in the square in front of City Hall, alone, without an entourage, without armor, no banners, in clean, simple clothes made of Pyongyang linen, barefoot. It was a gesture, calculated, well thought out. He wasn't playing the aristocrat. He was showing that he was different, that the rules here were different, that the land here was different. The chairman of the council was the first to step out of the carriage, an old man in white robes with an ivory cane. The others followed him, one by one, silk and gold on the Pyongyang cobblestones, and among them, Kang Tae-woo, the older brother. He stepped out third, tall, handsome, calm, in a black traveling cloak with 2 silver falcons on the shoulders. He looked at Do Jin. Do Jin looked at him. A foreign memory struck. His brother's face at the table, the voice that said, "Don't be afraid, I'm with you," the hands that ruffled his hair, and that same voice in court. My brother acted in a state of mental confusion. I ask for mercy. Mercy that turned out to be a quagmire. Do Jin didn't flinch. He bowed to the council exactly as much as was required. No less, no more than that. He invited them in. He led them through the park. They went first, just as he'd planned. The cherry blossoms had faded, but the plum trees were bearing fruit. The peaches were ripening. Lilies in the pond, green grass, white paths, silence, and the scent of the earth. 12 aristocrats walked through the park in silence. One of them reached out and touched the trunk of a peach tree. Then he looked at his fingers. Pollen remained on them, golden, real, alive. Then Jin led them into the city, along the curved streets that So-Arn had drawn, past the houses on stilts, past the blacksmith shop where the blacksmith hammered away without stopping, past the weaving workshop where a blue cloth hung on the loom, a color so striking that one of the council members stopped and stood there for a minute, past the school where children were studying, past the pharmacy where Jihei was arranging medicines, past the mill, which ran smoothly and quietly, past the pier where boats were moored, to City Hall. So Rin stood at the entrance. She did not bow. She wasn't required to. She was the architect. She opened the doors. The council entered and stood still. The town hall chamber, stone columns, a high ceiling, light from the windows fell in streaks across the floor. The arch above the entrance, the very same pointed arch that Li Hua had proposed. Perfect proportions. One of the council members raised his head and looked up at the ceiling. He said he'd never seen a vault like that anywhere. He asked who had designed it. So-Rin answered, "Me." The council member looked at her, at the woman in work clothes with a charcoal pencil tucked behind her ear. He turned away. He said nothing, but he remembered. Dinner. Do Jin prepared it himself. Not entirely by himself, of course. Jihei and 3 cooks had worked for 2 days, but he planned every dish. Rice from the Pyongyang fields, fish from the river, vegetables from the gardens, fruit from the park, herbal tea from Han Seoul, camphor oil for fragrance. Every bite of food came from a land that shouldn't exist, but this wasn't just dinner. Every dish was carefully chosen. Do Jin had spent a year gathering information for a reason. Yoon Mei brought back not only contracts but also rumors from every trip, what each council member liked, who had what weaknesses, who was sick, who was hungry, who was vain. He served the chairman a dish with ginger and honey. The old man had sore joints. Ginger and honey relieve pain. For the representative of the Huan house, a dish with cinnamon. A northerner. He misses the spices that aren't found in his cold province. For the temple priest, plain porridge. No garnishes, no spices. Priests take a vow of modesty. Porridge shows respect for his vow, and next to the porridge, a bundle of fresh herbs neatly tied. Herbs that treat a cough. The priest has a cough. Everyone heard it as he entered. Little things, details, attention. 12 dishes, 12 clues, 12 small acts of care disguised as hospitality. Yunmei stood by the wall and watched. Her eyes darted from dish to dish. She was counting. Not money, influence. Each dish is a thread. Each thread is a connection. Do Jin wasn't trying to win over the council. He was showing the council that he saw them, that he knew them, that he remembered. Dinner ended late. The council dispersed to their rooms. Do Jin remained alone in the hall. No, not alone. Kang Tae-woo was standing by the window. He hadn't left with the others. He was waiting. They stood in silence. Two brothers, one of whom was not a brother. Do Jin walked over to the table. He picked up a pitcher. He poured 2 cups, rice wine, from Pyongyang, the first harvest. He set 1 cup in front of Tae-woo. Tae-woo looked at the cup, then at Do Jin. Then he picked it up, brought it to his lips. He sniffed it and froze. His expression changed. For the first time all evening, the aristocrat's mask cracked. He recognized the taste. This variety of wine, this aroma. His mother used to brew this variety. On that very day when the mother of the former Do Jin drank her last cup, Tae-woo set the cup down on the table, without drinking it. He looked at Do Jin. His eyes were dark. His face was pale. Do Jin didn't look away. He remained silent. He didn't need to say anything. The wine said it all. I know. I know how my mother died. I know who's to blame. I know that you knew. Tae-woo was silent for 10 seconds. 20. 30. Then he turned and left. Footsteps in the hallway. Silence. Do Jin stood by the table and looked at the 2 cups. One full, one empty. His hands were trembling. Not from weakness. From someone else's grief that had become his own. The next morning, a council meeting. Open to the public. In the square in front of City Hall. 400 residents of Pyongyang stood around. The council sat at a long table. Do Jin stood before them. The charges were read aloud. All 5 of them. Illegal harboring. Illegal trade. Construction without a permit. Misappropriation of a waterway. Witchcraft. Do Jin listened. Then he began to respond, not to the charges, but to the heart of the matter. He placed 60 bamboo tablets on the table, complete documentation of Pyongyang's farming practices, soil composition, crop rotation, drainage, composting, mixed cropping, everything he had done, every step recorded and explained. He said there was no sorcery here. There was knowledge of how the earth works, how plants grow. Winter of the 2nd year, the calm after the storm. The council had left, and Pyongyang breathed a sigh of relief. But Do Jin did not. He knew that a postponed indictment was no excuse. It was a pause. And during this pause, each side would prepare its next move. The temple would gather evidence. The Mo House would seek allies. The K-Housen would wait. And Do Jin would dig downward, toward the root. He began the day after the council's departure. Every night he slipped beyond the wall. He made his way down to the river. He sat on the bank. He placed his hands on the ground and reached downward, toward a presence that pulsed 100 steps deep. Closer, even closer. With each passing day, he saw more clearly. The first rank root was not a root, not a tree, not a mushroom. It was all of these things at once. A gigantic living network that permeated the entire continent. The central node beneath Pyongyang. Thousands of threads radiating in all directions. Threads that carried nourishment, water, and information. Threads that had been sealed 1,000 years ago by a temple ritual. He saw the seal. It was not magical, not divine. It was physical. A layer of scorched clay 3 human heights thick. Clay saturated with salt and lye. A dead environment through which roots could not pass. 1,000 years ago, the priests did not pray over the earth. They flooded it with poison, salt, and lye. They killed the topsoil. They created a barrier. They sealed off the central node, and they called it a curse. Simple chemistry, brutal, effective, until Jin could lift it. He knew how to neutralize salt-contaminated soil. He'd been doing it for 3 years in Portland. Gypsum treatment, flushing, bioremediation, fungi that break down salt, bacteria that process alkali. He could break the seal, but he didn't know what would happen next. If the entire network were to awaken, all at once, what would happen to the continent's lands? The streams that had flowed for 1,000 years through the temple's artificial canals would surge through the natural ones. The ranks would collapse. First rank lands might become 9th rank. 9th rank lands might become 1st rank, or everything might become the same. He didn't know, and that frightened him more than the Council of Houses and the temple combined. He told Han Sol. They were sitting in the lab at night and he was sketching a diagram of the underground network on a bamboo tablet. Han Sol listened. She smoked. She asked questions. Smart questions. The right questions. She thought like a scientist. What if we didn't destroy the seal entirely? What if we made an opening? A small one, a controlled one, like a valve on a steam boiler. Release the pressure slowly. Let the network wake up gradually. Not an explosion, a breath. Do Jin watched her. Then he said she was a genius. She replied that she was a practitioner. The genius was her master. She was simply finishing his work. They planned the operation. The breakthrough point at the bottom of the river, where the seal was thinnest because the water had eroded it for 1,000 years. The hole's diameter, 2 paces, no more. Through the hole, the network would begin to breathe, slowly. Nutrients will flow along the threads. The lands around Puyan will begin to come back to life. Not in a day, over months, over years, gradually, naturally. Do Jin set the date. Yim Li built a system of sluices to divert water away from the breach point. Han Sol prepared a solution to neutralize the salt in the seal. So Rin reinforced the riverbanks in case the water changed course. Yun Mei stocked up on provisions for a month, just in case things went wrong. Ji Hei prepared medicine, just in case Do Jin became ill. Li Hua wrote 3 letters. Spring of his 3rd of that year, morning. Do Jin woke up and first thing placed his palm on the floor. A habit, a ritual, a daily check. The network was breathing, steadily, calm. Power flowed through the wires slowly and steadily, like blood through veins after a long operation. Through a tiny hole in the seal at the bottom of the river, life seeped out. Not a stream, a trickle, but enough. He sensed changes, distant ones. In the north, in the lands of the House of Huan, farmers noticed that the wheat had sprouted more densely this year. In the east, in the lands of the House of Mo, the wells had filled up ahead of schedule. In the south, fishermen in Heiju said that fish had returned to the bay they'd left 10 years ago. No one knew why. No one connected it to Puyan, not yet anyway. The town had a population of 500. 500 lives on land that didn't exist, until Jin stepped out of the house. From the new house by the river, the very one that So Rin had drawn. 1 story, stone, with a garden by the water, with a wide window facing east. He had moved in a month ago, so Rin had insisted. Yun Mei had insisted. Han Sol threatened to set the guardhouse on fire. Yum Li simply moved his things while he was asleep. Ji Hei placed a bowl of soup on the new table, and he realized it was pointless to argue. He went out into the garden. Willows by the shore, a camphor tree in the corner, a herb garden that Ji Hei had planted. Yum Li's workbench was under the awning because she'd decided that his basement workshop was better suited for her projects than her own, and Do Jin hadn't objected. So Rin's drafting table was on the terrace because she'd said the light was better there, and he hadn't objected to that either. The morning was quiet, warm, ordinary. He was walking towards City Hall along the winding streets, past houses from which smoke rose from morning hearths, past the bakery where Li Hua was already working. He could see her through the open door, flour on her hands, an apron over a simple dress, her hair pulled back. She saw him. She raised her hand. In her hand was a piece of fresh bread. He took it, took a bite, warm, with a crust, with a hint of honey. She had learned to add honey to the dough, on her own, without a recipe. Intuition. He nodded. She smiled. Not a mask, not porcelain. The genuine smile of a woman who had found her place. The square in front of City Hall was crowded. Market day. Stalls with fruits and vegetables, fabrics, clay pottery, fish, herbs, honey from the apiary they'd started 3 months ago. Children ran between the stalls. Old people sat on the stone benches that So Rin had placed throughout the city because people should rest and not just work. He walked through the market and greeted everyone, by name. 500 names, 500 stories, he remembered. The blacksmith raised his hand from the forge. Do Jin raised his hand in response. A weaver held up a new piece of blue fabric. Do Jin touched it. He nodded. It was good. She knew it. The teacher led the children out to the square for an open-air lesson. The children saw Do Jin and began chattering. He stopped. He crouched down. He asked what they were learning today. The teacher replied that they were learning to count. Do Jin asked, "Up to what number?" The teacher replied, "Up to 100. Do Jin looked at the children. He said that Puyan already had 500 residents, so they needed to count up to 500. The children groaned. He smiled. He walked on. Everyone was waiting for him at City Hall. So Rin with new blueprints, the 3rd bridge. Yun Mei with bamboo tablets, the annual report. Han Sol with the results of the river water analysis. Mineralization had doubled. The ecosystem was thriving, and the river was becoming richer. Umri with a design for a new type of water wheel, double transmission, twice as efficient. Ji Hei with the hospital report. She now called the pharmacy workshop a hospital, and she was right. 3 rooms, 6 beds, 4 students. Over the winter, they had treated 42 people. Not a single death. not a single one. Do Jin sat and listened, to each one, in turn. So-rin spoke about the stone, Yun-mei about silver, Han-sol about herbs, Li about gears, Ji-hei about people. Li-hua arrived later, with a bruise on her cheek, with a letter in her hand. A letter from Prince Li-hyun, an official one. This time, not via a courier, via an imperial messenger. The prince demanded a report, a real one, not the one she'd been writing for half a year. Li-hua placed the letter on the table. She looked at Do Jin. She said she could no longer lie, not because she was afraid, because Puyan no longer needed lies. Puyan was strong enough for the truth. Do Jin nodded. She wrote a reply to her brother in front of everyone. An honest one, a complete one, without embellishment or understatement. Puyan is a city, 500 people, trade, industry, medicine, education, the river, a park, walls, bread, all real, all on the dead land. And she, Li Hua, a princess of the imperial house, remains here of her own free will. She sealed the letter with her personal seal, not the imperial one, but a new one that Han-sol had carved for her from camphor wood. A peony, a symbol of what was dear to her. The messenger had left. They knew what the response would be, that the prince would be enraged, that the council would convene again, that the temple would not stop. But that was later. Now it was morning. A spring morning in a city that was not supposed to exist. Do Jin stepped out onto the town hall balcony. He looked down. The square, the market, people, children, smoke from the blacksmith shop, blue fabric hanging on a rope, boats on the river, the park beyond the southern wall. An oak tree on the hill, in bloom, as always, against all odds. He placed his hands on the stone railing. He reached down, through the stone, through the clay, through the silt, through that very same earth he had scooped up on the first day with his dirty hand in his wet hanbok. The network pulsed, alive, warm, his. He remembered the words he had spoken on that first day. Below him, in the square, So-rin was showing Yun-mei the bridge blueprint. Yun-mei was calculating the cost. Han-sol was smoking on the steps of the lab and jotting something down. Li was lying under the water wheel, tapping away with a hammer. Ji-hei was carrying a basket of herbs from the hospital to the garden. Li Hua stood in the doorway of the bakery, wiping her hands with a towel. 6 of them, all different, all indispensable, all looking in different directions but standing on the same ground. 2 goats grazed near the oak tree on the hill. Children chased a dog around the square. The village head sat on a bench, basking in the sun. He was feeling better. The camphor leaves that Do Jin gave him every week were working. A legless veteran rolled down the path in a wheelchair, cursing at the guard who had fallen asleep on duty. A baker, a weaver, a blacksmith, a fisherman, a teacher. 500 names, 500 stories, 1 city, his city, not his, theirs. Down in the square, an orphan girl, the very same one who had tasted a peach for the first time a year ago, was running through the market with a basket. Apples lay in the basket. She was handing them out, one by one, to everyone she met. A pear for the old man because his teeth were bad. A sour apple for the blacksmith because he liked sour things. A plum for the weaver because she had a sweet tooth. She remembered. Until Jin watched her from the balcony and smiled. Because that was what it was all for. Not the walls, not the contracts, not the money, not politics, not the rank system, and not the first rank route. The girl handing out apples. Because someone once gave her a peach and remembered that she'd never tasted anything sweet. Attention, care, memory, skill as a form of tenderness. He recalled a phrase, his own phrase, the first one he'd spoken in this world to the people who had become his people. Do not bow to me, bow to the earth. I simply listened to her. He stood on the balcony of the Pyongyang City Hall. Spring of the 3rd year. 500 people below. The river glistened. The park was in bloom. The oak on the hill was sprouting new branches. Beneath the ground, a 1,000-year-old network carried life along its threads to the far reaches of the continent. Slowly, steadily, like a heart beating after 1,000 years of silence. On the tree in the square, that very camphor tree he had planted from seeds brought by Yun-mei in a canvas bag, a new flower was blooming. Small, white, impossible, real, like everything in Pyongyang.